"Oh, thank you, Caroline. You've given me a lovely meal today. The mushroom cream soup was particularly splendid. Please give my personal thanks to your chef." "You're welcome, Mrs. Cynthia," she said with a smile. "Take the bill, business lady. You are always welcome in our cafe. Have a nice day." The tall lady in an expensive business suit nodded and walked out of the door of the establishment. Caroline, in turn, hurried to take the money to the cash register. Before doing so, she cautiously looked into the folder and found a generous tip there. "Thank you, Mrs. Cynthia," the girl thought to herself and mentally imagined how she could put this money aside to pay for her small, but so cozy flat, located in a remote area of the capital. After that, the young waitress tightened the knot on her dark maroon working apron and continued like a bee to flutter around the hall and serve the visitors who came to them for a business lunch. It was midday. That meant that most of the employees from the local business center were just about to have lunch. Caroline Butler was 22 years old and had lived in New York all her conscious life, although her mother told her that she herself had once lived in a small village in the New York area. Now the girl was orphaned by her only significant other. Her mom had died many years ago of a heart attack. The girl was only 16 at the time, and she took her mother's death very hard. It took many weeks before Caroline was finally able to pull herself together and get on with her life, out of the maelstrom of depression and longing. The only thing she had left to remember from her mother was a tiny photograph, which Caroline had placed in a small pendant in the shape of a heart. She wore this pendant without taking it off. It was like an amulet for her. In the most difficult moments, when it was difficult for her to make any responsible decision, or she was facing a difficult choice, Caroline always turned for advice and support to the spirit of her mother, with whom she communicated through a small silver jewel. The girl believed that Cheryl was her mother's name, hearing her and watching over her beloved daughter from heaven. Caroline loved New York with its bright colors and dynamic pace of life, although it was not easy to live here alone. Left without relatives, the girl finished school and immediately went to study at a culinary school. Someday, Caroline dreamed she would become a chef herself and cook the best dishes in the area, so that they would not be ashamed to serve even to some visiting celebrities. However, Caroline's dreams were not destined to come true at once. No one in the capital did not want to take a cook without any experience. All they could offer the girl was a position as a dishwasher or at best a waitress. Caroline chose the lesser of two evils, decided that the job of a waitress is still better and more profitable in terms of money than the fate of the dishwasher. Forced almost around the clock to clean up after the guests of the establishment mountains of dirty dishes. "All right," Agatha thought, "I'll work for a while. I'll gain experience and see how they have everything inside the restaurant kitchen, and then it will be further seen." Over time, the girl got so used to the lightning pace of her new job that she almost even forgot about the fact that initially wanted for herself quite different. However, this job brought her good money, and in the end, the young waitress managed to rent quite decent accommodation compared to some where she had to live before. In all this, Carolina remained a simple and friendly girl who always smiled at the sight of the guests of the cafe. She was happy to socialize with her colleagues and generally tried to keep a positive attitude in any situation. She evoked exceptionally bright and warm feelings in other people. She dressed simply and modestly, but always in clean and perfectly ironed clothes, and her attentive, light gray eyes gave her a reputation of a good listener. She was also a very interesting conversationalist, as she read a lot. Caroline liked to keep any conversation going and to be aware of everything that was going on in the huge world around her. She was like a sponge absorbing all kinds of knowledge and facts, not forgetting, however, in her free time to master new original recipes in her small home kitchen. Carolina has been working at the Silver Carp Cafe for almost 2 years. Before that time, she had managed to try herself as a waitress in several other establishments. But it was the Cafe Silver Carp became the place where the girl perfectly coincided all the conditions in terms of salary, schedule, and a good hearty team. In addition, it was here that Caroline met her happiness in the person of Harold Evans, a guy from a wealthy family who fell so much in love with the girl that he proposed within months of meeting her. Now Caroline was officially his bride, and what was the most joyful, but at the same time exciting for her, she was expecting a child from him. The term was still very small, only a couple of months, so the young people wanted to play the wedding as soon as possible. Caroline dreamed of looking as good as possible in the wedding dress, so that she would not have to adjust it to the features of Tia that had changed during pregnancy. Who would have thought that we would do it? Sometimes the girl thought to herself. We met then quite by chance. Caroline remembered the day when a quiet, brooding-looking young man with beautiful brown curls and a large, dictionary-like book in his hands had come into the cafe. Harold then ordered only coffee and a salad and chicken sandwich. The young waitress was just rushing to take his order when, ironically, a glass of juice fell to the floor from one of the neighboring tables and shattered. Even rubberist soles could not save her from a fatal pirouette, which the girl made by slipping on the sweet liquid. Oh, Caroline only managed to exhale when she saw the coffee cup topple over onto the neat, shiny hair of the young man reading. Harold shrieked loudly, more from surprise than pain. However, the flavored liquid had completely flooded his well-groomed hair and was now dripping down the lad's indignant face in large coffee milk drops. "What do you mean?" Choked with indignation, he began, but immediately stopped talking when he saw the confused waitress in front of him. "Forgive me, please. I'll bring you some napkins right away. Coffee and a sandwich will be on the house, of course." The young guest's face softened. He looked at the girl standing in front of him from head to toe, and then said at the same time, trying to brush off the remnants of thick liquid, "Come on, calm down. Nothing terrible happened. I must stretch myself. I have to take my head out of my reading once in a while." Caroline glanced briefly at his book. It was a thick economics textbook, and the girl quickly concluded that it was probably a student in front of her. "Napkins, though, you need them." "I'll be right back," Caroline assured him and ran to the back room. When she returned to the table a couple of minutes later, the guy was already gone. However, on the smooth wooden surface there was money and a small piece of paper. Confused at the end, the girl reached out and took a few notes and a note with only 2 words on it. "Pick you up later. Harold." Caroline was surprised and intrigued, and for the rest of the day she could not get this mysterious young visitor out of her mind. In the evening, Harold did pick Caroline up. He apologized to her for not being able to stay. However, according to the guy, he just had to start another pair soon, so he hurried back to the university. The young people got to know each other better, and as it turned out, they had much more in common than it might seem at first glance. Harold, just like the girl, simply adored reading, especially detectives. Whichever book Caroline named, it turned out that her new acquaintance had already read it and could formulate a clear opinion about its plot and main characters. Sympathy between them flared up at once. At first, the guy picked up the waitress after her shift and drove her home, and in their free time from work in the cafe, if in school they walked in the park or went to the cinema. For the first time in her life, Caroline was happy that she had a real admirer. Previously, she had not taken seriously the few courtships of her classmates and then classmates at the technical college. With Harold, however, it was different. The girl felt a beautiful, tender feeling of love arising inside her, which was growing stronger every day and was drawn to the same feeling that had arisen in the heart of her lover. After 5 months of tender and stormy relationship, Harold one evening took his beloved to a very expensive and luxurious restaurant. There, embarrassed and blushing, he took out of his pocket a small velvet box of blue color. Caroline's heart beat very fast as she took this box and her fingers trembling with excitement. "Is it really?" The girl couldn't finish her sentence and covered her mouth with the palm of her hand, feeling like she was about to cry. "And just open it," Harold asked, seemingly ready at any moment to start dancing with joy and pull Caroline with him. The girl slowly and very carefully pressed the latch and opened the dainty case. There on a tiny velvet cushion lay a gold ring with a large diamond. The drop-shaped stone, like a dewdrop, was framed by the finest gold stems. The piece looked absolutely divine. "God, it's so beautiful," Caroline whispered, stammering with an excess of emotion. "Caroline, do you like it?" Harold asked with hope in his voice. "No," he spoke hastily. "That is not at all what I wanted to ask you. Caroline, will you marry me?" Caroline felt tears of happiness welling up in her eyes. Delight filled her heart, for now she was sure that the groom loved her as much as she loved him. The girl put her arms around Harold's neck, kissed him tenderly, and then asked playfully, "What do you think? Should I think about it, or should I go right ahead with it?" Taking advantage of the guy's second confusion, Caroline laughed happily and lightly touched the tip of his nose with the words, "My beloved, of course I agree." "Yes, yes, yes." Harold happily embraced his bride and they continued to enjoy their evening together. A week after the engagement, Caroline realized she was pregnant. At first she was very afraid to admit it to her fiancé. She was very worried about it, but one way or another she would have to tell Harold about the baby, especially since they were going to have dinner with his parents. The young man couldn't wait to introduce his fiancée to them. Luckily, the groom was excited about the upcoming addition to their young family, and he hurried to tell his father and mother about it. Caroline discouraged him, believing that he should wait until dinner first, and if he was so eager, announce it there. But the lad persisted in his determination. From that moment on, the young waitress's life rapidly began to turn into a real nightmare. Marion and Jonathan Evans were literally shocked to see their future daughter-in-law. The groom's mother had never expected such a turn of events. This willful, demanding and incredibly capricious woman immediately disliked the girl as soon as she saw her at that first joint family dinner. "Caroline, tell me, do you always dress so plainly? Is it some sort of deliberate carelessness, indicative of a specific taste, or a deliberate strategy in your style? Maybe these things actually belong to some little known but niche, that is, especially expensive brands that not everyone can afford." Marion looked at the girl with a look full of dislike. Caroline then immediately realized that she would not have an easy time with her future mother-in-law. Not at all. The waitress smiled as friendly as possible, trying not to reveal the terrible anxiety she felt in the presence of the groom's mother. "I just don't think it makes sense to spend a lot of money on everyday clothes. Brands, after all, deliberately inflate the price largely still for the famous name written on the label. But why should we do that if we still tear off the label before putting on a dress? Besides, a lot of good and practical things can be found in ordinary shops." Caroline somehow didn't want to get into an open confrontation with Marion, as she realized that it wouldn't end well for her anyway. There was no point in proving anything to someone who had already made up her mind, and the future mother-in-law seemed to have already come to unequivocal conclusions about the girl. "Practical," he hissed Harold's mother through her teeth. "Well, that explains a great deal. You said, didn't you, it seems, that your mother came from the village?" "Mom," Harold exclaimed involuntarily, choking on a piece of baked duck. "What did I say?" The mother looked at her son indignantly. "A man shouldn't be ashamed of his origins, especially when he wants to enter a family as honorable as ours. Isn't that right, dear?" She turned to her husband. "Better to lay all the cards on the table at once, so that we don't have to wonder why some foreign admixture might suddenly appear in our breed." The woman said the last phrase with an obvious allusion to her son's fiancée. By that time, Harold had already informed them of his lover's pregnancy. Caroline flared up in a flash, but held back, only clutching the corner of a small tablecloth under her chair. "And I'm not embarrassed about anything, Marion," Caroline answered her calmly. "There are people living and working in the country too, by the way, no less, and sometimes much more, than in the city." "Marion, what on earth has bitten you today?" muttered Jonathan in a friendly tone. "Caroline is right. I, too, am against a woman spending too large a sum on clothes. No, I understand boots, fur coats once every 5 years." His wife gave the businessman a look that he preferred not to pursue the subject further. Harold's father, of course, was not particularly fond of his daughter-in-law either. However, he tried to keep his emotions and discontent under control. After all, his son would have to live with this simpleton, not them. Besides, Jonathan knew better than anyone the temper of his wife. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to it. He preferred to watch the battle unfolding in front of him, as if from the sidelines, with a slight irony and constant calm. Well, then the father of the family coughed, and then decided to turn the conversation in a different direction. "Let's better discuss the upcoming wedding. When do you plan to get married?" Well, Harold glanced uncertainly at his beloved Caroline. "We want to have the ceremony sooner because of the baby. We're going to go apply this week. So we were planning on having the ceremony sometime in the next month to month and a half." Marion, who at this time was cutting the tomatoes in her plate into thin slices, clinked her cutlery with a loud metallic clang. A malevolent smirk played on her lips. "You bet," she said so quietly that only her husband could hear. He looked sadly at his wife, sighed, and silently shifted his gaze from his son to his daughter-in-law and back again. "I warn you at once, the bride's dress and her hair, as well as her general appearance, will be solely my responsibility," Marion said aloud. "Clearly, we don't want the wedding guests to guess from which region my favorite son's future wife has come to us." Everything inside Caroline felt like it was on fire. She couldn't even breathe, let alone eat any of the food on the plate in front of her. She wanted more than anything to disappear or to be somewhere 1,000 kilometers away, preferably with Harold. The mere thought of having to live under the same roof as that sarcastic woman made her fearful. "All right, thank you, Mammy," Harold responded cheerfully. He seemed not to notice at all the blatant sarcasm and humiliation directed at his fiancée. "Caroline will be only too happy to have your help, won't she? Everyone in our circle knows you have the most exquisite, refined taste. Don't you?" Harold addressed his bride. "You will accept my mother's help with the wedding, won't you?" She looked into the eyes of Harold's mother and realized that she would do everything in her power to make the preparations for the ceremony a nightmare for the girl. Marion looked at her with a cold calculation before which her sister-in-law herself was but a helpless victim. "Gladly" was all the young waitress could manage to squeeze out of her mouth, and at the same time she put on her best smile. The rest of the evening passed in the same tension and constant attempts of her mother-in-law to hurt poor Caroline. She did not understand why she could not please her future in-laws so much. Was it only the fact that her roots were from the village? But what hurt the girl even more was the almost zero reaction to all these sneers of her fiancé. It was as if Harold was under the constant influence of his parents, afraid to say a word against their will. How could this be possible? After all, alone with Caroline, he was a completely different person, self-sufficient, self-confident, and certainly would not run at the first call of his overbearing mother. But what if he was? What if the guy's behavior was just a cover-up intended to win her, Caroline's heart? But the girl felt that the groom loved her, and that's why she hoped that he could still have the courage to talk to his parents, explaining to them that you can't do this to people who are not 5 minutes old. As soon as the young people left, the following conversation took place in the house between the spouses. "No, Jonathan, did you see that? Did you see who he brought home? It's a simple girl. She's a beggar and still there, married to a rich man. I don't understand the young people of today. It has been said so many times on television and in books. There's no happiness between partners whose union is not socially equal. No, they are still trying to get into the elite, by any means necessary. Only a blind man can't see that Caroline is a redneck, not worth our son's little finger. She managed to get pregnant by him too. She made a clever move. I can't say anything." Marian paced the drawing room with her arms folded across her chest. It was her usual way of expressing her extreme dissatisfaction with the situation. "If it weren't for Caroline, my son might have proposed to Maggie by now," Jonathan said dreamily, but a little sadly, as he sat down in a wide leather armchair and lit an expensive Cuban cigar. "Where did she come from? Maggie's father, Oliver, is a longtime business partner of ours. He's hinted on more than one occasion that it would be a good idea for our families to be related. I mean, being the same age, they're equal in status, and most importantly, we could merge our businesses together. It would be a win-win for everyone. But no, Harold's having adventures." The man exhaled a perfectly even ring of smoke. "What am I telling you?" The spouse continued to be indignant. "Oliver, his fortune is in eight figures, but where else is our son going to find such an excellent bride? It's like winning the top prize in the lottery. 1 chance in a million. "Jonathan," she said to her husband in a commanding tone that made him flinch a little, causing him to cough up his Cuban decroisse. "What?" Overcoming his cough, he asked his wife, and looked at her with genuine incomprehension. "But what?" Talk to him seriously. "Talk." Marian rolled her eyes. Sometimes she thought her husband was too slow-witted, which was why he missed out on exactly half of the money they could have now. "How do you imagine that?" The man genuinely marveled. "Am I going to go and say to him, 'Sonny dear, why don't you leave your poor pregnant bride and marry Maggie Brown? She's got a richer father. And anyway, we've got capital to rebuild. Is that it?'" Jonathan brushed the remnants of ash off his homemade jacket. "He won't thank you and me for that," he continued. "What's more, Marian will lose him completely then. Do you know how hot guys are at 25? God forbid he should run off with that provincial girl. We'll never see him or our grandson again. Do you want that?" Marian tapped her lip thoughtfully with a sharp fingernail with a perfect wine-colored matte manicure. "We don't know if it's our grandson at all. What if she got pregnant by someone else and decided to put someone else's baby on our son? That's the spirit of all those cunning provincials. You meet a rich guy and you get him right away, so he won't be able to get away with it." Jonathan shook his head negatively. "Come on, Marian. I don't believe it. I saw the way Harold looked at that girl, and she at him. Their love is mutual and real. And Caroline would not bear a child by another man. If you put it that way, it wouldn't be good for her. They realize that we can do a genetic test at any time, even without her son's knowledge." Jonathan looked at his wife eloquently. The elder Evans was 57 years old, while his beloved wife had not long ago turned 54. Until recently, their family had been quite affluent. Jonathan ran a successful business. Marian kept her own boutique of fashionable Italian clothes and accessories. That all changed 2 years ago when their financial situation took a sharp turn for the worse. Jonathan made several fatal mistakes when making a number of important deals. Because of this, the family rapidly turned from rich businessmen into middle-order businessmen. To Jonathan's credit, he never blamed anyone for his failures, well aware that he himself then poorly calculated the possible risks. The fall in profits one way or another they no longer had so much money to afford to play the field of more serious players. So Harold's marriage to the daughter of a long-time and reliable business partner was just about to solve the problem of renewing the family capital. Jonathan. Far-sighted parents dreamed of choosing a rich and promising bride for their son, and Maggie was the perfect choice. However, these dreams dissipated when Harold brought a poor waitress from a simple family into their home. "All right, we'll see if the bride can stand my special character." Marian smiled slyly at her husband. "Our Harold, after all, is very mild and suggestible. Sooner or later he will see with his own eyes that such a simpleton, this Caroline, is no match for him at all. Let us hope it will be before they go to the wedding." "What about the child?" Jonathan inquired cautiously. "It's quite simple, dear. If the child is ours, then she'll put up with everything and keep quiet, only to please our son. Still, she can't help realizing what a fortune she's made." "But what if she doesn't?" The woman looked expressively at her husband. He smiled understandingly and nodded briefly to his wife. "Then maybe all is not yet lost. Maggie shouldn't be discounted." The father finished for his wife and, satisfied, put out the rest of his cigar in the ashtray. Caroline stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom of her small flat and looked carefully at her reflection. She was pale, and there were dark shadows under her eyes, a sign of fatigue and emotional distress. Almost automatically, she adjusted the translucent white veil that was fluttering behind her back. It instantly responded to her mistress with a soft sheen, barely visible in the glass, after which the light weightlessness of the fabric was revealed. After that, Caroline lowered her gaze. The wedding dress fit her perfectly, as did the pearl drop earrings and the neat tiara made of hundreds of small, shimmering crystals. Her stomach was still as flat under the dress as it had been 3 weeks ago, even though she was exactly 3 months pregnant. That was normal. Cheryl had once told her daughter that her pregnancy was almost invisible until the 6th month. It was only then that the young mum's belly literally began to grow in front of her eyes. But despite the marvelous dress and luxurious wedding set, Caroline did not feel happy. God knows with what incredible labor she managed to repel from the future mother-in-law this particular version of her wedding attire. The last few weeks had been terrible for our heroine. Marian disliked everything about her, and no matter what the girl did to please her, everything was wrong. The mother of her fiancé did not like anything, not how Caroline cooked, or how she dressed, or how she moved at the rehearsals of their with Harold wedding waltz. Sometimes daughter-in-law even caught herself thinking that her mother-in-law must be dissatisfied with the way the girl breathed. Jonathan also added fuel to the fire, as he either agreed with his gloating wife or kept silent, reproaching Caroline, saying, "What can we do? That's the kind of daughter-in-law we have." She had to silently tolerate all this negativity or make jokes, making herself look even more ignorant in their society. Harold, of course, took his mother's words in a positive context and thought that Marian was teaching her future daughter-in-law the basics of survival in the secular society. The young fiancé almost never stood up for the girl, and if he did so in some particularly acute moments, the last word in argument still always remained with his toxic mother. The last scandal that had been caused by the groom's parents had happened just a couple of days ago. They literally drove the girl to hysterics, so that she even feared for the life of her still quite tiny child. That day, Marian and Jonathan announced that they refused to see friends and colleagues from the cafe from the bride's side as guests at the wedding. Not only that, but the mother-in-law insisted that Maggie, the daughter of their longtime business partner, be the maid of honor. Such a turn, of course, upset Caroline terribly, and she tried to stand up for her real friends. "I don't understand, Marian. What exactly is it about my guests that displeases you?" she asked, clenching her hands into fists with despair. "They're wonderful, cultured people. I've been working side by side with them for 2 years now, and I've never once had a complaint about them, either from our cafe patrons or from anyone else." Before she could reply, Harold's mother laughed wryly. "No. Do you seriously suppose I'm going to allow any poor people to go to my only son's wedding? Are you out of your mind at all, girl? Wake up. We'll have dozens of famous guests coming to the restaurant, many of them people of such high standing that you've never dreamed of. Their cufflinks alone are worth more than your entire cafe. No, that's out of the question. This is not a village party where everyone gets drunk by the end of the evening and starts singing folk songs. This is a different kind of event. By calling these people poor, you're calling me poor. Do you even realize that?" Caroline said, unable to hold back the tears that choked her. "My love, you take it all too personally," Harold cut in. "Mummy wants what's best. In fact, there really will be some very influential guests there. I'm not saying your friends are any bad. I'm just saying that they may indeed be uncomfortable being in the company of wealthy people like that." "I would ask you not to insult my loved ones," the girl said aloud, unable to stand it. "Calm down," Jonathan waved her hand in the direction of Marian's consort, "or she just can't get over the fact that our son has essentially lifted her out of poverty. But it's hard for a man to believe in his happiness at once. It happens. It's okay. We will definitely be able to re-educate her." Caroline, too, no longer embarrassed, cried, standing in front of her rich relatives and fiancé, feeling incomparable humiliation. Finally, she quietly whispered towards her future mother-in-law, "Do whatever you want. I can't take it anymore." With these words, the girl ran out of the restaurant, where they discussed the upcoming festivities, and rushed to her home. On the way, she heard Harold call her by name. But Caroline did not turn round. The groom did not hurry to run after his beloved, reasonably believing that her emotions were probably heightened by the pregnancy and the upcoming wedding, and that it would be better to just give her some time to come to her senses and calm down. And now the far from happy bride stood in her room and thought about whether she should marry a man who was not only unable to protect his woman from the attacks of her relatives, but also agreed with them, making her feel worthless and Sponger, whom she would marry only because she was carrying a child and a dear heir under her heart. The car was to arrive at her door in half an hour, to take her first to the registry office and then to the fancy restaurant where Marion was in charge. Caroline looked in the mirror again and saw the girl's lips quivering in the reflection. After stroking her stomach and taking one long, deep breath, the girl resolutely pulled off her veil and tiara and threw them on the bed. Quickly changing into jeans and a comfortable shirt, Caroline threw all the essentials into her suitcase. She slipped out of the house as inconspicuously as possible, trying not to be seen by the neighbors. In half an hour, she was already sitting on a bench near the bus station and crying bitterly. The girl had actually run away from her own wedding, although she had the most tender feelings for her fiancé, but she could not accept his weak will and the absence of any support from his side. This was not how Caroline had planned her married life. The last thing in the world she wanted was to be just another piece of furniture in someone's ornate living room, from which she could be thrown out at any moment, if only such a piece of furniture bored its overbearing owners. "What's wrong? Honey, why are you crying?" suddenly asked the girl by someone's affectionate voice. Caroline slowly withdrew her hands from her face and looked at the speaker. In front of her stood a genteel old woman. The old woman was carrying a small wheeled cart filled to the brim with something. From beneath the mottled kerchief on her head, silver white strands were poking out. "I don't get any ideas. I was just passing by to buy a bus ticket," the woman continued to say. "I could see that you were unwell. I thought I'd ask you if there was anything I could do to help." "I don't know. I seem to be lost in this life," said Caroline, sobbing, wiping away her tears with her fist. "Yesterday it seemed like I still had everything ahead of me. A whole new world would open up. And today it seems that I have lost everything and destroyed it all with my own hands. But I couldn't do otherwise." The old woman looked at her carefully, as if she were trying to see something special in Caroline's appearance that she could not see. At last the woman suggested, "A traveler on the road won't last long without a signpost. Come with me to the village. It's not far, about 15 to 20 kilometers. My name is Megan," the old woman introduced herself. "What do you mean, come with you?" The girl was confused. "No, I shouldn't. I don't feel comfortable somehow. I am, you see, expecting a child. Why should I embarrass you?" Megan smiled slyly. "Oh, come on, honey. If I was embarrassed, I wouldn't be proposing to you. I live alone, but I don't starve. I am a healer. I can cure any ailment if I choose the right herbs, and people pay me well for my predictions. I tell fortunes accurately and always correctly. I can tell you everything about any person except for myself and my family. That's forbidden. But time doesn't make me look young. I need a helper to help me to make gatherings and record people who comes from the locals or from all over places. That's what I'm offering you. Let's go. It won't make you feel any worse. But maybe you'll find your way again. The veil that lies over your fate will be cleared." After some thought, Caroline agreed. This deed was dictated more by the hopelessness that the girl felt at that moment. She was also afraid that Harold would find her, and then his mother would take out on her all her anger for spoiling the wedding of her precious son. So Caroline moved in with Megan and lived with her. The woman in the village had a large house with 2 floors and comfortable outbuildings. She kept all her herbs and ingredients for her healing potions there. It was also used as a pantry. Here on high wooden shelves were stored jars with all kinds of winter preparations, dried herbs and small fish, which sometimes Megan was brought by the village fishermen. The days flowed on, bright and blissful. Caroline helped the old healer with the household chores, sweeping and washing the house, cooking. In short, she did everything she could to justify her stay in her house. She was still a little ashamed that she had come to a strange woman's house like this. Megan, however, wasn't exactly letting her take on all the maid duties. "Will you settle down for a while, you little brat?" the old woman asked with a kind smile. "Think of the baby. It's not good to work so hard. The dust won't run away anyway. You can clean it up afterwards." Carolina replied with a merry laugh and continued cleaning. She was glad that the old fortune teller treated her humanely, and so she wanted to make her already difficult life easier. The girl told her about her past and how she had been bullied by her fiance's rich parents. In response to this, the mistress thoughtfully remarked that everyone would be rewarded according to his deeds, and the highest justice will surely come to these people. People came to Megan from different towns and distant villages all the time, and all of them needed the help of an old woman who could see the future and cure almost all diseases. Gradually, the witch doctor began to teach her skills to Carolina, trusting her first to mix simple potions from dried herbs, and later to prepare healing concoctions. One day the girl asked her to read her fortune, and Megan gladly agreed. But no matter how much the fortune teller looked into the lines on Caroline's hand, she couldn't see anything. "That's odd," the woman said slowly, twisting the girl's palm this way and that in front of her. "What do you see?" The young woman's curiosity made her herself draw her face closer to the mysterious drawings that twisted along her left hand. "I can't see anything." "The fog is thick." The fortune teller blinked and let Caroline's palm out of her hand. "You must be tired today. I'll tell fortunes another time." Caroline did not pester the old woman, though she was curious about what might await her in the future. She had seen with her own eyes how Megan put almost hopeless people on their feet, and therefore she had no doubts about the power of her gift. The young girl had no idea that Megan spent the whole of the next night next to her bed, scrutinizing the sleeping Caroline's face. "What is wrong with you?" Megan asked herself. "Why can't I see this girl's life? Has the gift become weaker because of age?" The healer took a deep breath and shook her head sadly. It wasn't time for her to lose her power yet. Oh, it wasn't time. Once, when Caroline was recounting to the old woman the contents of the many love stories she had read while living in the city, she mentioned that her mother had taught her to read and showed her a picture of Cheryl. Megan stared at the face of the young woman in the photo for a moment. Then slowly she asked the assistant, "Jesus, honey, where did you get that picture?" The elderly healer's voice and hands trembled like an autumn leaf in the wind. Caroline was even startled. "Megan, are you not feeling well? Would you like some tincture or stronger tea? Just tell me, and I'll be right out. I don't like the look on your face. You've become very pale." The healer, instead of answering, clung to the girl's hands, holding her on the wooden bench from which Caroline was struggling to get up. Megan felt her breath was about to stop if she didn't hear the answer to her main question. "Caroline, don't dither. Tell me, where did you get that picture?" The old woman almost shouted to her pregnant assistant. "So my mother left it to me shortly before she died," said Caroline, looking at the woman with undisguised amazement. She did not understand what her benefactress could have found so intriguing about the face on the old, rather faded photograph. "Nevertheless," the girl continued, not wanting to offend Megan, "this photo was once taken by my dad on my mom's camera. My mom said my dad was a trucker. One day his car broke down on the road, and he stopped by her village. When they saw each other, they fell in love. They only had one night together. The next day, my father had to be back on a flight. Mom never saw him again. And 9 months later, I was born. And the only evidence that I had a mom and dad is contained in this little photo card." That's the story. Caroline closed the lid of the pendant with a sad smile. "It can't be," the elderly healer whispered slowly and suddenly rushed to a chest of drawers. She rummaged around and pulled out an old, tattered photo album. Carefully sitting back down on the bench, Megan opened the album in front of the girl. "Look," she ordered the young assistant in a trembling voice. Then she poked first one photo in turn, then another and a third. Now it was Carolina's turn to be surprised. Her own mother was looking at her from the numerous color and black and white photos. The young girl felt the ground go from under her feet. "What?" she whispered, unable to contain the flood of emotions that suddenly came over her. The feelings, like a turbulent mountain river, risked dragging her into its bottomless maelstrom. "But I couldn't even think. It turns out my mom lived here. Did you know her, Megan?" The old witch doctor only shook her head instead of answering. Every word she spoke fell on Caroline's heart like a heavy stone. "Not only knew, my girl," she whispered excitedly. "Lord, what an old fool I am. I couldn't think of anything at once." Caroline pressed the palm of her hand to her mouth to keep from shrieking from the emotion that overwhelmed her. She was both afraid to hear the truth and already guessed what the older healer was trying to tell her. "That's why I couldn't see anything about you," the old woman said, with difficulty holding back the tears glistening in her eyes. "Caroline, you are my blood kin, my granddaughter." For a moment, Caroline stared at Megan in silence. And then the realization came over her in a powerful and hot wave. "Grandmother," the girl said slowly, sobbing. But how can this be? How is this possible? Shocked, Caroline could hardly imagine that the woman who had treated herself and her unborn child was actually her blood relative, and not just anyone, but her grandmother, the most related person on earth after her mother. "Will you let me hold you?" Caroline asked timidly. Megan didn't bother to answer anything. She only rushed over to her newfound granddaughter and clasped her in a tight hug. "Grandma, Grandma, I can't believe it. How long I've dreamed of having any more loved ones left on earth. And here." Caroline stopped being shy and cried. "My darling," Megan answered her also through her tears. "My heart felt that fate had brought me to you for a reason. Something inside me knocked that I should have stopped by your side and offered you help. And this is what it turns out to be. Native blood." A little later, when both women sat down at the table, Caroline decided to brew her grandmother a healing potion. The shock of the previous day was too great. Megan continued to tell Caroline her mother's story. For the pregnant assistant, it was as if the healer had opened some kind of secret door through which Caroline could see the shadows of her own past. "Your mum Cheryl lived in this very house a long time ago," Megan said, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her shirt. "I put all the pictures away on purpose so I wouldn't have to go through all the trouble. My daughter and I were fighting about her unplanned pregnancy. I told her that she should have learnt my gift, helped people, and she didn't want any of that. Cheryl wanted a normal and peaceful life for herself with a husband and child. She said she was going into town to look for Stephen. That was the trucker dad's name. That's where she gave birth to you. I never saw her again. She stopped writing almost immediately. I thought she'd found happiness. It must have been a simple resentment, a misunderstanding. Would you know, granddaughter, how much I would have given to see your mom for just a moment, to say, 'Cheryl, how much I've missed you all these years.'" Caroline sympathetically covered the witch doctor's hand with her own and tried to reassure her. "You shouldn't be so upset, Granny. Mum couldn't track Dad down then." "What, really? Really?" "The town was too big, and it's not like he was really there. But whatever it is, I'm by your side now and I'll never leave you. I swear to you." Megan, who had calmed down, perked up again. "So what are we sitting around for? Granddaughter, let's go to that herald of yours and his family and show those scoundrels where they belong. I'll put such a curse on them if they don't apologize to you that no priest will ever be able to cleanse them." Caroline gestured to stop the older woman's resolute attitude. "It's no use, Granny." "They don't need me," the girl said with sadness in her voice. "If he hasn't even called me once in all this time, it means I've been written off long ago. Suddenly, when we get there, they'll have guards on us. What can I say? Rich people can afford to change girls like gloves." Megan gave her granddaughter a hard look, but backed off nonetheless. "She looks just like Cheryl. Don't you worry too much. We got by without him. We'll live on, and not worse than them, rich and heartless." And so they went on living. 6 months later, in due time, Caroline gave birth to a wonderful son, who was named Michael. The boy was very similar to his mother and grandmother, and Caroline was secretly glad. At least there were no traits that could remind her of her broken heart and unfulfilled hopes. Megan loved her favorite great-grandson and, despite her advanced age, never stopped playing with him and telling him their local village tales. A year passed. One evening during a heavy downpour, Megan heard a quiet knock on the door. "Who could that be?" Caroline asked, who was fiddling with little Michael on a large round knitted rug. Mother and son were playing with a small fluffy kitten that had come to their house this summer. The old witch doctor frowned at first, then pressed her lips together as if she sensed something amiss. "Sit in the next room, granddaughter," she commanded. "Go in there with Michael. I'll get it." Caroline became anxious, though she complied with her grandmother's request. Just in case, she closed the door loosely behind her so she could hear what was going on in the front room. Megan unlocked the thick oak door, letting the drenched travelers in. It was a married couple, husband and wife, gaunt, seemingly lost in their last hope. "What have you come for?" the witch doctor asked them rudely. "And I thought you wouldn't come at all." "Well, it must have been the higher powers that brought you here, since you came on foot to such a distance. All the buses were canceled," a man in his 60s complained to her, "so we had to literally knead the mud with our feet. Would you be so kind as to let us at least shelter from the weather in your shed until morning?" The healer was silent at first, and then turned to the woman. "What do you want? I see that trouble has brought you to me. Otherwise, you would not have sought my way forever. I have taken care of that." She looked at the late visitor with a frown, not at all friendly. "We have a son missing," the woman said, choking back her own tears. "His name is Harold. It's been 3 weeks since we've been able to find him. We've had the police and private detectives involved, all to no avail. No car, no sign of him, no sign of him. Help, for God's sake." The woman, sobbing, pressed a dirty handkerchief to her eyes, and her husband began to stroke her shoulders, trying to calm her down. "We were brought to you by word of mouth. They say you can find a person from a photograph," he said, and pulled out a medium-sized photo from the inside pocket of his waterproof jacket. "Here, look, please. Maybe he is at least still alive." The fortune teller reluctantly took the photograph from his hands and, looking at the chap depicted on it with frank dislike, whispered, "Is that what you are, son-in-law?" At that moment, the door creaked open and Caroline came out with her son in her arms. The young mother looked at the newcomers with contempt. After all, they were the ones who had lost their favorite son, Michael's father, and were now looking up at their failed daughter-in-law with their necks craned, completely shocked at what was happening. "And good evening to you, Marion. You see, I'm back in my native village, just as you dreamed." The girl's eyes burned with outright hatred towards the people who had, in fact, broken her life. "Why did you mock me while you were in power? And now you've come to my grandmother to ask for help," Caroline said angrily. "Caroline, my dear, forgive us for Christ's sake." Marion, as she was in her gym trousers and boots, fell on her knees before the girl. "We were fools, I repent, not to see our happiness in you. We married our son to that Maggie, and she turned out to be such a bitch." That's where the snake was, wasn't it? But only not immediately they were able to see it. The witch doctor squinted, answering her granddaughter. "That maiden and her father raked up the rest of our wealth and left us all naked." Jonathan nodded, looking at the women with regret and pleading. "Harold decided to start a construction firm to feed the 3 of us somehow. But he's had some bad luck," he continued. "Caroline, forgive me and my neglectful wife. Only you can save our Harold. Whatever you want for you and your grandson we will do. Forgive us fools, eh?" Caroline, though angry at her frustrated in-laws, but her heart was not made of stone. Besides, she'd never wished Harold dead, so she nodded to her grandmother. And the latter, after waving her hand over the picture for a few seconds, said slowly, "I see your son is alive. They keep him in a room, but not in a simple one, but somewhere deep underground. Either a cellar of some kind or, I can't say for sure. There's a tall, curly-haired man standing next to him. His name is strange, outlandish, not ours, not Russian. Ben, I can also smell the letter. I see it as B." The strangers pondered for a minute over what the fortune teller had said. Then Jonathan's face suddenly brightened. "Ben Black, that's right. That's Harold's friend. They raised that young firm together, the one Harold went to negotiate the contract for, and he's got a bunker under his house. He bragged about it to us when he came to visit." Following that, Marion cried and thanked Megan and Caroline. Thank you. We're going to go back right now and report everything to the police." "You don't need to go anywhere right now," the witch doctor replied. "There's bad weather raging outside. It's dangerous. You'll go in the morning. Now, get undressed. We'll soon have dinner. I'm heating soup in the pot. At least you'll meet my grandson. If Caroline doesn't mind." "I don't mind," her granddaughter answered her in a calm but slightly detached tone. "Only don't take him in your arms. He doesn't like strangers trying to hold him. He's not used to it yet." "But I'm not a stranger," Marion said with a touch of resentment in her voice. "I'm his grandmother." "It's too early to talk about that," Caroline reminded her. "We'll see about that later. In the meantime, try just talking to him for a start." All evening the guests fiddled with their grandson. In the morning they took the first bus back to the city. There they gave the police all the information they had, and operatives were immediately sent to Bleck's cottage. It was exactly as Megan had seen it. The businessman decided to deceive Harold and tried to take over Harold's promising firm. However, Ben turned out to be a coward and failed to personally eliminate the young man. Instead, he locked him in a bunker under his house, where he hoped to starve him to death, and then take his body into the woods and make it look like Harold got lost in the woods and died of natural causes: hypothermia, lack of water and food. After Bleck was arrested and Harold returned home, the young man radically revised his views on life. Nearly starving to death underground, Harold realized how high a price he had paid for the cowardice he had once shown. His father and mother told him that his rescue would never have happened if Caroline and his grandmother had not agreed to help them. The man immediately went to the village and on his knees begged his former bride to forgive him. Harold began begging his ex-fiancée to forgive him. Not immediately, but Caroline forgave him. True, before this young businessman had to try hard to win her heart again. If before he listened to the opinion of his parents and everything and never crossed their will, then now finally began to live and act on his own mind. This pleased Caroline and Megan, who had told her granddaughter in advance that Harold really loved her all this time, but could not get out from under the influence of his parents. Now, Caroline and Harold were married after all. They have moved back to the city and are now raising Michael in their home, living apart from Marion and Jonathan. However, they do not forget them or Megan as time and work matters allow. They visit the old healer in her village. Caroline now runs her own small family restaurant, where she often cooks and which is popular with the people in the neighborhood. Harold has succeeded in the construction business, so the family had enough money again, except that the former arrogance of former rich people has disappeared completely, and they no longer evaluate the people around them by the amount of money in their bank accounts and purity of origin. The story of the kidnapping of the son and justice to the young daughter-in-law has taught them a lot. Not having met his wife from the maternity hospital, the husband went to his mistress. And 5 years later, Barbara was walking home from the antenatal clinic. But no, walking is the wrong word. She was hopping, then suddenly quickening her step, then stopping on the run. The young woman was happy and kept replaying in her head the words of the pretty doctor. "Are you going to have a baby? Are we going to register? Or do you have other plans?" After such a provocative question, Barbara almost angrily retorted, "Did you really think I would want to terminate the pregnancy?" The doctor smiled. "Why were you so shocked? You're young, you're beautiful. According to the examination, you're perfectly healthy. Now girls like you, trying to make a career, make their way to the top, and strengthen themselves on the material Olympus. Only then, in their 30s, do they think of procreation. You're only 21. Things happen. You and your husband are still students, I take it?" The woman's doctor was right on the money. She and Calvin were still in their 4th year of university. He's a lawyer-to-be. She's a philologist. But their flat is not a rented one, but a real one, their own. They live in 2 cozy, spacious rooms. It was the parents on both sides of the family who had splurged on the apartment as a wedding present. Barbara lit up with pleasure, imagining Calvin's delight at her news of the addition to the family. They'd been married for 3 years, but things had somehow never worked out before with a baby. She'd even dragged her husband to a consultation at an expensive private clinic, where they'd been examined from top to toe. The summary was pleasing. Both are practically healthy. No physiological incompatibility is observed. Be patient for 1 year to 3 years if you are not specifically using protection. Lack of conception is considered normal, they were told at the clinic. Barbara smiled slyly at the time. Any hint of contraceptive use was immediately put to rest, she told Calvin. "It's too early, you say, and you would like to buy nappies and a nappy at about 40 years old. Maybe it's too early for us to have a close relationship, if you are not yet morally ready to take responsibility for the child. When you're mentally ready, I'll keep you warm." Calvin agreed with her reasoning pretty quickly. And who among men would like all these restrictions and obstacles? It's just boredom and zero fun. The subject was once and for all closed. Except that once a month, Barbara's mood briefly soured. Her body signaled that she was, alas, not pregnant again. In the years of reckless youth, such disappointments passed quickly. Calvin would drag her out to a nightclub, to the cinema, or to her favorite pastry shop. Then they'd sit side by side, cramming notes, each on a different subject, serious ones. Calvin liked to quiz her on the U.S. Penal Code, testing his memory at the same time. Nonsense, his wife judged through gritted teeth with a disapproving look. "I can't get those laws mixed up. I know the criminal code almost by heart, unlike you. So who are you giving a stern look to?" Honey used to look tough when he was a lawyer. The world of crime is not a family life, spell it with an I. They usually ended with a passionate reconciliation in each other's arms. Barbara dreamed again. Maybe it's happened, and she's already pregnant. Barbara came from a large family, adored all four of her sisters. She couldn't imagine life without children's voices and the noise of the house. The Smith family in a town near Los Angeles knew everyone. No kidding, they were proud of them. Olivia was too bright for a small town. How did her parents come to name this red-headed, freckle-faced beauty? She was always either pregnant or nursing. The girl gave birth one after another. All the daughters were completely similar to the handsome father, who could play in the cinema some English lord. Call him Christian, as his parents called him, the townspeople refused flatly. He was called simply Chris since he settled with his wife in this favorable town. The story of their young family from the first moment aroused the burning interest of the neighbors, the descendants of old-school immigrants. Their ancestors had migrated to the United States with the Germans under the great leaders of the country, when German colonists were drawn to the lands between the great rivers. Croats, Englishmen, Poles, Serbs, Bulgarians were occasionally found among them. A mixture of blood, a mixture of nations. The descendants have almost no authentic features left from those ancient times, except that they still gave their children unusual names by American standards. And so it turned out that in a shady town drowning in orchards, settled permanently Christian and Olivia. The tradition of giving their children rare names was probably the only thing that this family kept sacredly unchanged. They named their first daughter Amanda. Then came Bridget, Florence, Barbara, and the last baby, Emma. Chris and Olivia, as they were persistently called in the town, were considered hard-working and good-natured people. They loved their girls and the land, which gave them rich crops for their careful care. And everything would have been fine and quiet. Only fate had decreed otherwise. On little Emma, it seemed, the laboring woman's strength had run out. God was no longer going to grant Olivia any new heirs. Moreover, already at an early age it became clear that the tiny Emma is not all well with health. The disease was selective. Emma had no difficulty swallowing water or food. She didn't have any seizures that frightened others. She was barely behind her peers in speech, hearing, and vision. Her fate was weak muscles that did not allow her to move freely according to the inexhaustible childlike energy. The little girl's body seemed to be in some terrible spasm all the time. It was both frightening and painful to watch. Olivia, who had always worked in the garden, had suddenly grown quiet. She stopped wearing brightly colored sundresses, smiling at neighbors when they met, chatting to women in the queue at the shop. When there is real grief in someone's home, people secretly try to avoid people so that the negativity is not transmitted. Christian and Olivia marveled at this sudden isolation at first, but then they accepted it. God is the judge of these hard hearts. Mary, the elderly neighbor, who had been through a lot herself, did not separate her parents from themselves. On the contrary, Mary kept telling Olivia, "Come to the witch doctor Betty, who lives 20 kilometers from us. Maybe she can tell you something. What to do with your baby." After listening to her recommendations, Christian and Olivia decided to do the experiment, put little Emma in the back seat of their car, and went to the address. Betty asked no unnecessary questions. Whispering with her lips, she crossed the girl and gave her verdict. "Don't shed your tears for nothing. Your child is sunny, kind, affectionate. She will continue her strange movements with the support of her arms and legs. But she will warm people's hearts all her short life. Soon she will begin to do her chores. She will have no equal in affection and warm power in your town. Everyone will want to touch the magic girl to warm her soul." And then Betty quickly ushered them out the door with the girl. Christian and Olivia drove home in silence, and then the woman seemed to burst into tears. "My dear husband, you have always been with me in sorrow and in joy. I'm sure that you will be with me through this journey to the end. In the meantime, let's bring laughter, joy, and smiles back into our home. Let's raise all of our daughters in love and harmony." Christian and Olivia kept their word. They returned home revitalized. Happy streams flowed down their arms. The trees had already bent their branches, laden with large, fist-sized apples. In the vegetable garden, the unharvested potatoes were waiting for their time. Bright orange carrots nodded with lacy green. The ripe beetroots, grain to grain, fruit to fruit, what went into the cellar, what would go to the market. Barbara's parents had set themselves the goal of raising their daughters to be educated and honorable people, and they were stubbornly pursuing their dream without turning back. Barbara had already pressed the doorbell when the mobile phone rang in her purse. When she heard her husband's voice in the receiver, she immediately made her voice as mysterious as possible and whispered, "Calvin, I have a terrific surprise for you. You're going to have a sumptuous celebration dinner tonight," Wendy said. And the good news she wanted to tell. She needed something else nice to put her lover in a romantic mood beforehand. But Calvin said that he was busy, running to the skating rink, but by the appointed time will be sure. On the kitchen tiles on the floor, the mum-to-be glides like a waltz. Chicken with round potatoes around it into the oven. Red fish, which she loved immensely, into the frying pan. Now she will still put together a salad of fresh cucumbers, tomatoes with herbs and garlic, and the holiday dinner will be ready. For Calvin, a bottle of wine; for herself, a fan of a healthy lifestyle, sweet carbonated drinks. No, I'm going to have to cut out the sugary drinks for now. Their baby didn't need that bubblegum chemistry. Barbara looked round the table once more, took out the brightly colored paper napkins she'd been saving for special occasions, set out the plates from the old porcelain set with gold ornaments. She stacked the massive forks and knives next to them. She had never been able to like all that fancy modern crockery, thin and clinking, made like twins, where similar sets were indistinguishable from each other. For dessert, there was good old Praga cake, which she had adored since childhood. Maybe she remembered it so well because their first family trip to the big city ended with a visit to a bakery, where everyone was bought a large sliced cake Prague, generously poured with chocolate icing. Since then, it had stuck in her memory that where that cake was, there was the happiness of serenity. Barbara twirled around the wardrobe, choosing an outfit for dinner. She wanted to impress her husband's imagination with the news of her pregnancy and her appearance. She was sure that in the aggregate everything would look like fireworks, would strike Calvin to the core, would touch his tender, loving heart. Her spouse did not deceive her expectations. At the appointed time, she heard the keys rattle in the keyhole and hurried to meet her soulmate. "Betty, you look fantastic," Calvin announced to her from the doorstep. "What kind of holiday are we having today?" "What are you all dressed up for?" Calvin asked. "Don't rush, darling, change first. Here are your house slippers." Calvin gradually changed, washed his hands, and went to the table. He thought to himself with annoyance, "I should have at least bought some flowers on the way." Was it for nothing that he had recently started working part-time in a reputable law firm? Now he always had some money. It was not all to ask his parents for pocket money. Of course they won't refuse, they don't count every penny. But independence is better than material dependence. Barbara put the salad on plates, took out a ruddy chicken from the oven, shyly glistening with its fried sides and a halo of golden potatoes. She made up her mind and blurted out, "My darling, I'm so happy. We're going to have a baby." Calvin immediately turned pale, and then his face turned red. He almost choked on his wine, and then asked fearfully, angrily and sharply, "Are you sure? Have you been to the doctor?" Barbara looked up at him in surprise and thought for the first time that she didn't appear to know this man or his reactions well. It's a shock. Calvin, meanwhile, came to his senses and unleashed a harsh, implacable monologue. "You've had enough. All the adventures you wanted. Pram, cot, porridge, sleepless nights. Have you thought about me? Am I ready to be a dad at 22? I told you to see a doctor and get yourself some reliable birth control. I don't need all this baby stuff here. If you're old enough, go and get an abortion." The young woman couldn't believe her ears. Her husband was saying all these words. Her always courteous, so gentle and attentive Calvin, with whom they had walked side by side until the leather wedding. As recently as 2 months ago, they celebrated their 3rd wedding anniversary. "Do whatever you want." "I don't want this baby," he said flatly. "I hate to tell you, but I'm a big believer in the child-free movement. Do you remember the word child-free? That's my credo." "If you get rid of that baby, then we'll talk," Calvin said flatly. "In the meantime, I'm going outside to get some air. Your fancy news makes me feel a little sick." Barbara threw her things into her bag, shedding bitter tears. A thought ran through her mind. "That's not my Calvin. It's like he's got a demon in him, making him say all those horrible words. I'll go to my parents for a while, come to my senses, share the good news with them, and he'll cool down and change his mind," she decided. "Otherwise, how can I live with such a weight on my heart? I don't even want to think about what would happen if all this wasn't an accident, but a sudden collapse of my family happiness and my whole life." Calvin sat at the bar in a cozy drinking establishment and couldn't understand how he had found himself here. The subdued light streaming from the beautiful orange fixtures created a stunning, soulful atmosphere. None of the visitors made any noise, nor did they stand out in the general chorus of voices. There was a group of pretty girls sitting right next to Calvin, celebrating something in a small circle of women. Even they, who were clearly already tipsy, were having a lively conversation without attracting too much attention from the men. 200 grams of cognac," Calvin said to the bartender. "And a slice of lemon without sugar, please." He drank the amber liquid in one gulp, as if intoxicated. Immediately he ordered another drink. He felt warm inside. He felt that his tongue could hardly move in his mouth. But he was suddenly so anxious to complain to someone that he started talking to the bartender. "You see, brother, Barbara and I have always been different. I've never been attracted to any girl before her. Just flings. And she's beautiful, hair black as pitch, eyes gray-green, penetrating as if she was looking through me. A luscious figure." The tipsy Calvin gathered his strength and continued his confession. "One thing about her, I never understood what is the passion for these little creatures, always disturbing parents to live peacefully. What nonsense." Calvin was indignant. "I want a child, and she's driving me crazy with her dreams. At least God was merciful and didn't give us offspring for 3 years. And then I come home today, and there's a festive table, wine, my wife all dressed up, eyes shining. I could have expected anything, but not such a sudden surprise from her. She's pregnant, you see. Did she ask me before baffling me with such a freeloader?" A ringing silence hung over the table where the pretty girls were sitting with cocktails in their hands. All the girls at the hen party could hear every word Calvin said, and they began to whisper, wondering to whom of those present such words about children were addressed. Only to those who were careless and had no desire to procreate. And he himself would like to live carefree and carefree. The young ladies laughed at first, but then began to go home at once. The mood was ruined. Only Maya looked back at the impolite young man at the door. "Handsome, you could make a film as a hero lover. He's a fool when he's drunk," she thought, and opened the front door sharply, catching up with her friends. The time was late. Barbara was sitting at the suburban railway station, where the last train was about to arrive. She hadn't seen Calvin come home drunk and hadn't even noticed the absence of her suitcase. Her husband collapsed on the bed and fell into a heavy sleep, not feeling guilty about the quarrel. Barbara called her father, who certainly wouldn't be surprised by her late arrival. Something had happened, then. Christian listened to her confused speech in silence, then answered meekly. "I'll be waiting for you at the railway station, daughter. Be careful on the road, and I'll tell Mom that you missed us unexpectedly." Olivia listened outwardly calmly to her husband's news of Barbara's unexpected arrival, and did not let on that the news had caused her any serious concern. closing the gate behind her husband's car, Olivia went round to see who was still under her parents' wing. Amanda and Bridget had been living with their husbands and children in different cities for years, wherever fate had thrown them. For them, Olivia was completely at ease. Just today, she'd been chatting to both of them on her mobile phone. 19-year-old Emma was tossing and turning in her sleep, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Florence was quiet and serene in the realm of Morpheus. In her 23 years, she was a sturdy girl with nerves of iron, the first helper in the house and garden for the not-so-vigorous and young Christian and Olivia. The woman lovingly stroked her youngest daughter's shoulder, smiling. "My sunshine." Anna. There were no frowning clouds of unhappiness around the boy's neck among all the household. Their trip to Betty's witch doctor had a magical effect on the villagers. Before, they had all tried to pass them quickly. Suddenly Olivia, or Christian, would stop them in the street and say, "I brought some goat's milk for Emma, but I've got enough. Where is it going? And you have a special girl. God bless her." At other times, someone would sneak in a bowl of strawberries, a bucket of May honey, or apricots under the wicket. If Olivia was carrying a girl in a wheelchair, no one would turn aside from their path. Then one day an unforeseen event happened. 2 yards away from the Christian family home lived another family with many children. They knew no grief, only there were boys growing up one after another. Their mother, Agnes, worked on a farm. Their father was a trucker. He drove cargo all over the vast country. No one could say how it happened that they went off and climbed up to the barn. After work, grandmother looked after them in the farm, but that time she lost sight of them. They managed to climb up to the high roof without any obstacles. But how to climb back down, they didn't think about it at the age of 3 or 5. Nothing sensible went into their heads. "Jump down onto the straw," suggested the eldest of them. To his misfortune, the little one jumped down, and he fell unluckily on his back, breaking his still fragile spine. Agnes, who had come from the cows at the cries of the neighbors, picked the boy up and dragged him to the infirmary. But it was impossible to touch him with such an injury without qualified medical assistance on the spot. The young body eventually fused the broken bones in the wrong way. The boy remained somehow bent, and when he grew up a little, his legs stopped obeying for good. He was taken to the regional clinic, and the doctors there consulted with foreign doctors. The verdict was the same: it was impossible to help the boy. Now he would have to live like that until he was old. Agnes, in her 35 years, turned into an old woman in a flasher, and her husband's temples were thickly grayed. She would look at her son, sigh in silence, and then she would be off again. There was a sepulchral silence in the house. Not a laugh from the younger boys, not a groan from the most crippled child. It was as if everything had died out. And then one day Agnes came to Olivia's house to get a pair of scissors to trim the excess branches on the trees. And in the house, Olivia Emma was just sitting by the window with a book. She raised her bottomless brown eyes to Agnes and held out her hands to her. Agnes was surprised the girl came up, took her hand, and remained silent. And Agnes felt a warmth flowing through her veins and veins. Believe it or not, a heavy stone had fallen from the shoulders of the blameless mother. She looked at Emma carefully, thinking that this girl was not destined for a happy life either. And how kind and warm her face glowed. At home, Agnes immediately started cleaning, baked cakes, and read stories to the boys. She bathed the eldest, changed his clothes, and put him on a high bed with a mountain of pillows under his head. Now she had other thoughts in her head. Fate is hard on us, but my boy is alive and with me by my side. Time will tell how long we both have to live like this, but I will try to make him learn everything that his maimed body will allow him to do. Get the sadness out of the house. You will not break us, but the miraculous warmth, which can heal the soul and guide those on a positive path who do not see a way out of a difficult situation. The news soon spread throughout the village. Some ironically dismissed it, others decided to test her gift for themselves. Moreover, one gossip girl claimed that the girl was a sorceress bringing her out into the open. And it turned out to be the other way round. When Emma stretched out her hands, which could give warmth and comfort, the woman was like an electric shock. And the girl's arms and legs began to twitch so violently that Olivia, who was sitting nearby, was frightened. "Little witch," shrieked Agnes, the experimenter. "You electrocuted me, you charlatan." Emma didn't say anything back. Olivia, on the other hand, was not confused. "That's how I knew I shouldn't have let you in the house. Her neighbor, how many people go to her house? It's never happened before." Her daughter, who had already arrived, stopped her. "Mum, don't. Everything is fine." The girl had never mastered long sentences, but it was always possible to understand her speech. Emma smiled briefly and took another look at the woman who had come for her warmth and added, "She won't come again." It was impossible to conceal any incident in a small village. The villagers believed even more now that Emma was a child with an extraordinary gift for soothing the heart and soul. Since then, her abilities have never been abused unnecessarily. And when they did, they always wanted to be near the sunny girl and soak up her positive energy. Olivia was distracted by the sound of a car pulling up to the house and hurried to meet Barbara and her husband on the doorstep. "Barbara, honey, it's so good to see you. Your eyes are tearful. Is something wrong, daughter?" The woman quickly put the kettle on the cooker, took out from the shelf strawberry jam, vases with biscuits. By the way, why ask about something excited from the doorstep? Maybe their conversation won't be for men's ears. After getting everyone drunk on tea and sweets, Olivia sat down on the edge of the bed next to Emma. "Shall we talk about the good stuff or leave it till morning? The morning is wiser," she asked. Barbara stretched happily under the warm cotton duvet, took her mother's hand, and whispered, "I'll tell you all the details. Tomorrow, Mummy. I'll tell you the main thing: I'm having a baby. I am ready to go through any trials to make this baby come into the world." She said the last words almost through sleep, having time to think. "I'm home. It's so nice here." Olivia smiled understandingly back at her daughter, but she couldn't see anything else. "Here's another one of my blood, soon to be a mum herself. Life flows like a full-flowing river, past steep banks, past flowering meadows, past joys and troubles. One generation succeeds another. No one can stop these laws of being." May had been stirring the sugar in her coffee cup for 10 minutes now, monotonously passing the teaspoon round and round, not even noticing that the flavored drink had long since cooled down. She couldn't get that man in the bar and his words about not accepting children in the family out of her mind, and was ready to announce it to the world. All the way back home, her girlfriends kept telling her he was wrong. Without a baby, a family will always be incomplete. Aren't infertile women the only ones who go out of their way to become mothers? May didn't share their enthusiasm. She liked to take a long look at herself in the mirror in the morning. When all the household had gone to work, she admired her perfect body without a single external flaw. And who needs this huge, ugly belly, turning a woman into a scarecrow, she thought. I could so easily have done without all this torment and ordeal. And who decided that motherhood is a woman's lot on this earth? Nonsense and nonsense. I may see my destiny in being the mate, or better still the wife, of a handsome man like the one I saw in the bar last night, to share his views, to live a life of pleasure together, just for ourselves, the ones we love. What's not a splendid plan for the rest of your life, May said aloud. She had not, of course, announced such a manifesto to the girls yesterday. These friends are already dreaming of a full family with all the consequences that entails. I wonder if that man is a regular visitor to their favorite bar, or was he there by chance? I should go there more often in case our paths cross again, she pondered. After a cold coffee and a piece of cake, May hurried to the university. Her diploma defense was in a few months' time, and her thesis report had nothing in it yet. She was going to get an earful from her supervisor. At 7, Calvin was awakened by the insistent melody of his favorite song. The lead singer of the band, with a strained, squeaky voice, right next to his ear, kept repeating, "You hate." God, he thought, waking up with a hangover, I wish I hadn't learnt German at school and university. The obvious translation wouldn't have got on my nerves then. The song was his favorite track. That's why he put it on his phone to his mum's call, as he lovingly called the woman who brought him into the world. Calvin had a surprisingly warm relationship with his mother. If his father once chased him for negligence in studies and laziness in sports, sending the boy to the section almost from the age of 5, his mother always took pity on him and fulfilled any whim. He simply could not answer her call. "Honey, what's wrong?" Mom asked him right off the bat. "You both haven't picked up the phone since last night. Did you go out with your mates on a weekday? Or are you so busy with your books that your ears are filled with knowledge like cotton wool?" Calvin tried to reconstruct in his head the events of last night, starting with his arrival home. He walked through the rooms, looked in the kitchen. Barbara was nowhere to be found. It was clear that his wife hadn't been home last night. "Mom, I'll call you back," he said sharply into the phone. "I can't talk now, there's something I need to find out." In a few minutes, Calvin knew that together with Barbara, their suitcase, with which they had recently traveled to the sea, had disappeared from the flat. His wife Barbara's personal belongings in the wardrobe had also disappeared. There was no point in even thinking about it. The young woman could only have gone to her parents. Calvin brewed himself a cup of coffee, found last night's dinner in the fridge, ate a cold chicken, and thought about it. Then he dialed his mother's number and went on the offensive. "Can you imagine? My wife is going to have a baby. How does it happen in this position?" and asked interestedly. Did she fly in or what? Was surprised by the potential grandmother on the other end of the line. "Can you imagine?" Calvin replied. "It was an idiot's dream come true to have a screaming baby at my disposal." "How can you be so rude?" The woman raised her voice slightly. "Son, in a normal family, a baby is a normal thing. A natural result of a man and a woman living together." "But you, Mother, don't start lecturing me now," he interrupted. "I've already expressed my position on the matter. I offered her to terminate the pregnancy. But she's stubborn. She packed her bags and went to her parents in the suburbs. What am I supposed to do? Get on my knees? Talk her into coming home?" His impassioned speech had no effect. His mother's response was merciless. "You're going to clean yourself up right now. I can hear in your voice that you were pretty drunk last night. You're going to Barbara's parents, and you're bringing your pregnant wife home. Your father and I have always indulged your little foibles. We've spared you no expense, no effort. But I don't want my son to be a scoundrel, forcing his wife to run away from home when she's pregnant." "Mom, but I don't want to become a father at 22, whimpered the misunderstood Calvin. "This decision is final and cannot be appealed." His mother cut him off and pressed the disconnect button. Calvin realized that he was not even between hammer and anvil. On the other side of the barricade, where not only his wife but also his parents were the opposing side, he had no doubt that his father would also take his mother's side. With a frustrated sigh, Calvin headed for the shower. There was nothing to be done. He would have to go. He reached Barbara's hometown at about 3 in the morning. The day was slipping towards evening. The orange orb of the sun was slowly going to rest somewhere in the neighboring yards. Dogs barked, alarmed by its footsteps. It was as if the street had died out, though quite a few people had come out to the station with him. It was as if they had all vanished into thin air. There were no other villages nearby. A whole crowd got off the local bus with him. Many people knew him here, especially those who had enjoyed their wedding. They had celebrated it twice, so as not to offend anyone. First in the city, in a restaurant, in the circle of his parents' acquaintances, and then in the village, right in the yard, to an old cassette recorder. And then, as usual, an accordion with folk songs. Calvin had never understood this rural tradition of inviting everyone to the table, but Barbara had told him straight away. A girl's wedding is her most important holiday. Even those young ladies who do not make a cult out of it dream of showing off in a white dress in front of many spectators, and I am no exception. Looking over the fence, Calvin noted that all his wife's family was at home. He'd have to confront his wife in front of witnesses. He pushed open the gate and froze. Olivia was looking at him from the window. He realized at once that she already knew about his quarrel with his wife. Yeah, well, there was nothing to do. He squared his shoulders and strode proudly to the porch. No one came out to meet him. He hesitated in the hallway, and then his wife appeared at the door with eyes full of vague hope. Maybe he's changed his mind, he'll apologize to her now, and everything will be as it was before. And then Calvin, instead of repenting, calming his beloved, saying that he had been wrong, had overreacted, froze in his tracks. It was as if demons were playing in him. He suddenly looked angrily at his wife and hissed, "I thought about whether you and I need a child. My answer is still no." Barbara turned pale. Her thoughts were dashing feverishly. "He's a stranger. He's a complete stranger to me. I'll carry the baby, I'll hide the baby. He will be mine alone." In the room beyond the wall, Christian and Olivia jumped at once at the sight of Emma convulsing in her chair. They were already aware of the scandal in Barbara's family, of course, but they decided to give the young people a chance to talk it over again. They stayed out of it for the time being. Emma was still hysterical, pointing out of the window, sobbing, whispering, "It's bad. It's bad. It's bad." Christian jumped out into the yard just as Calvin grinned mockingly, spat contemptuously on the ground through his teeth, and shouted, "1 month I give you, wife, to dispose of this gift. It's either me or the baby." What happened next was like a slow-motion film from a melodrama. The father-in-law grabbed Calvin by the scruff of his jacket, pushed him out the gate, and said angrily, "Don't you ever set foot here again, you lousy puppy. We'll raise our grandson or granddaughter ourselves without such a daddy. Don't you dare set your nose here again. What kind of puppy are you? Dogs are loyal creatures, and you, as I see it, have no idea what loyalty to a loved one is. Get out of here." Calvin stumbled to the bus stop to get to the railway station. It was getting dark. It was likely that the last train into town had already left, but he wasn't thinking about that right now. Trying on the empty platform, he negotiated with a local taxi driver. The good thing about money at his parents' expense was that he was not constrained. In town, Calvin decided to stop by that nice bar to drown his father-in-law's humiliation in brandy degrees. Nothing. He would somehow find common ground with his parents in this matter. They won't give up their only favorite son. Or would they still defend their decision? May did not meet the guy that night and went to a familiar bar alone, without any curious friends. What was her surprise when the young man walked into the bar in even more upset feelings? He went straight to the bar and ordered a large portion of cognac. He drained the glass in a gulp and looked round the room, which was almost empty before closing time. The time was approaching midnight. May didn't waste any time. When else would she get a chance like this? She put on the mask not of a femme fatale, but of a slightly sad girl puzzled by some problems of her own. She slowly approached the bar, smiled at the bartender as if with effort, and said, "I'm not having a good day today. Pour me something stronger, please. It may be unseemly for a lady to drink, but I don't have an ounce of socialite in me right now." Calvin turned round interestedly, thinking, "Someone else's current day has gone wrong. I'm not alone in my sadness," he said aloud. "Let's drink to all the good things together. There are good things." May pretended that she only noticed that she was not alone at the bar. She shook her ashy hair beautifully, opened her blue eyes wide with long, thick, black, skillfully painted lashes. "Come on, young man, where has our life been yet?" Calvin ordered a martini for the lady. For some reason, he was too shy to offer her a cognac. They talked about nothing. They had much in common in their preferences for cinema, music, and books. Both of them were quite educated, moderately intelligent, quite advanced people. Even the barman began to look at them with a sidelong glance. The establishment worked according to the system of service to the last visitor, and these two did nothing, completely dissolved in each other. He was already nervously, while they were talking, looking at them with the look of a faithful dog, which it was time to walk. And the glasses had to be polished 10 times over. It was no use. Calvin and May sipped slowly from their glasses. They were talking about something again, and even laughing. The bartender had given up hope of spending the rest of the night in his bed. And then the sweet couple suddenly got up and went somewhere quickly. He only heard the end of their conversation. The man happily said that he was going to order a taxi for the lady. And the lady told him that after such a heart-to-heart conversation, she would like to invite him to her place for a cup of coffee. That was quick. How did it work out for them? Involuntarily thought the employee of the drinking establishment, locking the door behind the last customers. Why am I surprised, though? How many people come to our bar separately and then leave together? How does Pushkin put it? A cruel age, cruel hearts nowadays, everything is easy and simple. An age soft on morality, hearts easy on disposable love. I'm getting a little philosophical with fatigue. Home, hurry home and go to bed. And Calvin was tenderly hugging his new acquaintance May by the shoulders in the back seat of some foreign car. He didn't even look at the model of the car out of joy. May's unexpected offer to continue the evening at her house threw him at first into some confusion, then encouraged him. Well, let Bridget be a mum-to-be. Other women are interested in me. Now I'll prove it to her and myself. That night was a vivid revelation to both of them. May, who had already had some experience, had never met such a man. Calvin, to his amazement, realized that intimacy with his wife, which had seemed a miracle to him, was far from sensual perfection. It was just before morning when they both collapsed powerlessly on the pillows. Satisfied with each other, they fell asleep almost simultaneously. Calvin only had time to think. Life's getting better. A couple of hours later, his happy mood was dampened by a call from his mother. "Calvin, I'm waiting for news. Are you home from Barbara's yet? My father and I are going to buy some sweets tonight and come over for tea. We'd like to congratulate our daughter-in-law on becoming a mom. It's a very exciting event for every woman. What time do you usually get home from class?" Calvin freed himself from May's embrace, who had fallen serenely asleep on his shoulder. Calvin looked around. His parents absolutely had to know nothing about him waking up in a strange bed with May. He would very much like to continue this wonderful companionship, but introducing her to his parents would be a wild thing to do. "Mum, don't worry," he said into the phone. "We had a productive talk with Barbara and her parents. Together we decided that it would be a good idea for her to stay with them a little longer. Autumn is pleasantly warm so far. The orchard is full of wonderful apples. The vitamins and fresh air won't hurt her mum-to-be. And in a week I'll go and pick her up and bring her home. We'll make up for it at university. It won't be a problem." Calvin couldn't even explain to himself why he had taken this time out from his mother. Maybe it would have been better to announce that their marriage to Barbara was over. They would each go their separate ways. But Calvin didn't dare give this information to his mother. This night had been too dreamy, too much to think about. May woke up and stretched sweetly like a contented, satisfied cat. Calvin didn't need to know that her parents had nurtured and cherished her always, like a fragile and delicate flower. cultivated in her the notion that she was a princess, a girl who should know no worries or troubles. She never knew denial of any of her whims. For 3 years, she had been living in her own flat, which she was given after successfully completing her first year of university. She chose a purely female profession, economist. To be fair, there are also many economists among men, but May in this area imagined the male sex only in the position of chief financial officer, nothing less. And all these high regalia were not important. She wanted a man who was wealthy, handsome and intelligent, to be a colorful addition to him. Calvin seemed to her just such a promising option. She would do her best to find out more about his far-reaching plans for her life. The fact that the man was married, about to become a father, didn't bother May in the least. It was a warm and sunny autumn morning. Outside the window, a magical golden autumn reigned. She and Calvin were about to have coffee and pancakes. Yesterday she ran in and her mother left her daughter a whole container of ruddy, fried scones with cottage cheese, and then outside to walk through the rustling yellow dirty leaves. To breathe the pleasant air, filled with the last scents of autumn flowers still in bloom. To stop by some pastry shop, where they know how to make delicious little cakes with prefabricated cream, her favorite treat. Emma had been hysterical for several hours after Calvin's arrival. It was the first time it had happened. Christian and Olivia no longer knew how to calm their youngest daughter at the grocery shop near their home. Olivia met Agnes later that day. That first heartache patient who had once been so warmed by Emma's touch. The women got to talking. Agnes was very enthusiastic about meeting the young doctor who had traveled from the city to see their disabled son. "He is extraordinary," she said. "This young doctor specializes in the moral rehabilitation of young patients. A psychologist from God, he tries to make their lives more fulfilling, more lively, to adapt them to society." "And what methods does he use?" Olivia was immediately interested. "What do you think, neighbor? Maybe it makes sense to show him our Emma when he comes to visit you next time." "What he does and how he does it, I can't tell you," Agnes replied. "He talks to his charges in private. What I do know is that my son is always enthusiastic after his visits. His eyes shine with joy. He no longer feels so sad about his situation as a sedentary patient. Even on the street on his wheelchair now began to show up without undue strain. And recently Lucy, a young girl whose boyfriend died in the conscription service because of an accident, started to look in our house. She and my son would go to the bench outside the yard and talk about something for hours. Somehow I couldn't resist my curiosity." May listened to what Lucy was saying at the time. "I still can't get her words out of my head," she said to Olivia. "She was right," she said to Olivia. "What did she say?" Olivia couldn't resist asking. "I won't repeat it verbatim, but the general meaning was like this," Agnes explained. "God, I'm glad you're alive. If my beloved had come back from the service wounded and maimed, I would still be with him all the time that heaven has given us." The women were silent, immersed in thought. Only each of them was thinking to herself about her own misfortune. Each knew what her friend in misfortune was thinking now. There is nothing worse than looking at your child and knowing that he is doomed to a different life than the rest of the human race. Unbearable, they thought. Sometimes this hidden inner pain. Accepting it over time is possible. To accept it is hardly possible. Agnes promised Olivia that she would get a sensible doctor to see Emma next Tuesday, and so they parted. They both hurried home to their eternal chores. Agnes was not deceived. She had fulfilled her promise. On Tuesday, a handsome young man in his 30s knocked on Christian and Olivia's door. If the owners had been asked what his first impression was, they would have said with one voice, "A good one." David was a pleasant, charming, intelligent doctor. He made it clear right away that he wanted to talk to his mom alone. And the girl herself didn't object in the least. They talked for over an hour, and then David agreed to have dinner with them. It was getting dusk outside the window. It was a good time to get together at a cozy table. David got to talking to Barbara. The woman herself did not realize how she had managed to tell him that she was pregnant and that she wanted the baby very much. But her husband did not approve of her decision to give birth. The doctor looked at her carefully and replied, "Men often come to maturity much later than women. Most think about it when they see the baby. Their paternal heart starts beating more frequently. But there is a certain category of gentlemen to whom children are only a hindrance in life. It's a waste of time to rehabilitate them," David concluded. After a delicious dinner, which David praised, Barbara volunteered to escort him to the bus stop. "I don't mind," said the nice doctor. "It would do you good in your condition. The bus stop isn't far. The lanterns in the village are working properly. Mum's to be need fresh air like air." And he laughed at his joke without being embarrassed. "Tautology, Barbara," he explained. He was incredibly easy to be with. There was no need to think about what you wanted to say, no need to choose words, no need to be afraid of sensitive topics that affected her ego. This psychologist had clearly chosen his profession for a reason. Emma had not had a single tantrum during the week. Not once had she stomped her feet or thrown her toys. Barbara had met her soulmate. That was the impression David had left on her. David took the train into town and reminisced. Olivia hadn't misjudged his age. 6 months ago, he had been 30 years old. 15 of those years he'd spent making sure that people with disabilities, and congenital diseases smiled at the new day. Their family was considered a real medical dynasty. At the same time, they were not arrogant in the least. David's grandfather was a renowned geologist. His grandmother worked all her life as a nurse in a neurological dispensary. All 3 sons then followed in their footsteps. The eldest became an oncologist, the middle one a surgeon, the youngest a traumatologist. When the only son David was born in the family of the youngest, no one could think that he would want to become a professional psychologist. He loved her very much, his desk mate, his classmate, his childhood friend Sally. David had grown up to be such a tough kid, tall and broad-shouldered beyond his years. He was angular at first, and then he became stately. He and the new girl were put at the same desk in 5th grade. She was thin, a little pale, and very, in his terms, beautiful. Even a short haircut for a boy did not spoil it, on the contrary, made her huge gray eyes somehow very piercing, bottomless, a little pitiful. After a week, he started bringing bright yellow apples with small freckles for her from home. She loved them very much. Sally came from a broken home. Her mother got a job at school with the girl and worked as a cleaner. David and Sally's classmates tried to make barbs about the girl, but he stopped them so sharply and decisively that no one seriously began to mess with the tall boy. Sally didn't want to go to the costume New Year's Eve ball for the middle schoolers. Her mother didn't have the money for what she called a waste of money. So David brought her home for the first time, and he and her mother made Sally a costume of Maya, the little bee from her favorite cartoon, out of gauze, gold tinsel, and black paper. By the ornate Christmas tree on stage, when the costume contest was held, Sally's big eyes made a sensation. The main prize, for some reason a huge blue teddy bear, almost as big as Sally herself, was immediately handed to her by the head teacher. On the 8th of March, in the 6th form, David's mum bought a real Barbie doll for her son's friend. There was no limit to the envy of the girls in the class, but David and Sally had not been interested in all those envious glances for a long time. They walked to and from school holding hands. David was always the first to go to the cafeteria, and he took 2 glasses of tomato juice and sandwiches with doctor's sausage. After a quick snack, they would run into the classroom to go over the assignment together. Both of them studied only for A's. Sally, petite and wearing a short-sleeved shirt, had become almost a full-fledged member of David's family. After school, they would go straight to his house, where lunch was waiting for them on the cooker. Warming up soup, mashed potatoes, or pilaf, They quickly demolished it all. In good weather, they would go for a little walk in the neighboring park. In cold and inclement weather, they would watch adventure films or fantasy on TV. Their views and taste matched in almost everything they did together. Sally's mom looked past their friendship. The perpetually tired woman had no time to check who her daughter was spending time with and how much time she was spending with them. No problems with her studies. That was fine. A terrible misfortune fell on Sally and David slowly, but rapidly. Once on another winter holiday they went, as usual, to the skating rink. Suddenly a little figure skater, who skates very well, fainted right on the ice screaming with lights. David, who came up to her, somehow immediately realized that the matter was serious. He picked up the bee in his arms and dragged her to the medical center of the entertainment center, where the skating rink was located. A businesslike woman doctor from the ambulance dictated clearly teenage girl, 15 years old, I assume a heart attack. David went to the hospital with Sally. You should have seen the confused state he was in. The crew allowed him to take a reclining seat in the back of the car. On the way he got everyone up on their feet, his grandfather, his father, his mother, his uncle. Half an hour later, everyone who could support David in his time of need had arrived at the hospital's emergency room. The diagnosis was devastating. A gray-haired cardiologist came out to them and announced that the girl had a neglected congenital heart defect. "Hadn't any of you doctors ever noticed that she might have had sudden blue lips? Weakness?" he asked. David stepped forward. "I spend whole days with her. There's never even been a hint that she has a health problem. She's ahead of the curve in PE. She rarely missed a class. She's on par with everyone else in class." "What can I tell you, dear colleagues?" answered the cardiologist. "The girl seems to have a strong, courageous character. She naturally felt sick, but did not show it. Her ailing heart had weakened, and then there was the slightly delayed age of transition. If she'd had heart surgery as a child, she'd have forgotten about it long ago. We're going to rush her into surgery now, but only a miracle can save her." There was no miracle. Sally's heart stopped. 2 hours later, David's heart stopped right there on the operating table with it. And in the cemetery, among the wreaths of snow-white flowers, David's sturdy figure in a dark jacket seemed from afar like a rock, a monolith frozen by grief. Even those closest to him did not realize what he had put in the coffin for his faithful friend. It was a last gift, a sign of very great love and tenderness. The guy spent the whole day going around all the toy shops until he found a small but very colorful bee Maya in one of them. When the first clods of earth began to fall on the coffin lid, David walked to the edge of the grave and said, "I never got round to telling you that I love you. I was afraid you'd laugh, because we were only friends. I promise that I will devote my life to curing the deprived, unaccompanied hearts of longing. In your memory, my love. Without you, my world is empty." David kept his vow to his beloved friend, as they say, bulldozed into his studies after her death. He graduated from school with a silver medal, entered the medical university on a budget without problems. All his free time was spent with scientific literature of the medical field. Already in the third year, I knew quite well the works of Carl Jung, Freud, Karlin, Corley, Zinchenko, Grigorenko, Kuzmina. He absorbed their thoughts and conclusions, judgments, sometimes not remembering to whom they originally belonged. But he absorbed everything in a row, as a sponge absorbs water. The boy was not a monk. He understood perfectly well that to keep himself in austerity is at least stupid. He was successful with his classmates, had brief flings, but no one managed to melt the ice in his heart. At first, such hot attempts in his address, many young ladies still undertook, but soon realized that this always a little gloomy young man is not believed in any female tricks. Why he behaved like that remained a mystery. His sad love story was known only to those closest to him. They were not going to talk about it. Then David had a long practice. He asked for a part-time job in the neurological dispensary, where his grandmother once worked. David assessed the situation soberly. Mentally ill people, and those who survived the tragedy, remaining mentally healthy but lost due to their grief. For society, these are two big differences. The public in the treatment center was diverse. For himself, he singled out a few cases where it seemed to him that mental illness was a natural extension of the immense grief of losing a loved one. Evelyn, 40, had been admitted to a neurological institution after she began wandering around the entryway dressed as a ghost. She could not accept that her beloved husband had been killed in a car crash. He came to her in sweet dreams almost every day, saying that he was near, just lives now in a parallel world. All she has to do is reach out her hand. Evelyn learned her lessons from her nocturnal visits with her husband and made herself a costume of an inhabitant of otherworldly worlds. Wore it when dusk fell. Then she looked for her soulmate outside the house, in the entrance, scaring the neighbors and passers-by. In the daytime, the woman became herself again, lived her usual withdrawn life quietly and peacefully. The respectable people did not approve of such night ghost phenomena. They wrote a report to the district police. Evelyn was taken to the dispensary quickly, and then she finally became despondent. Her husband stopped visiting her at night. She began to think seriously about leaving the world. So she would be more reliable, it seems, with him in that favorable, otherworldly world, and then her husband would be there again. The head doctor was rather skeptical about David's initiative to work with this woman. "Father, you've chosen a difficult case, both quiet and violent at the same time. We keep Evelyn on medication all the time. She sleeps all day long. I can't think of anything wrong with her. But I want to bring her back to a full life," objected the young specialist. "A beautiful woman, she was a businesswoman. But what has she turned into? We must make her happy again with summer sunshine, winter fluffy snow, autumn beauty of fallen-colored leaves, and spring delicate aroma of mimosa sprigs." The old professor smirked and added an admonition only at the end of the dialogue. "Our basic principle is to do no harm. And remember, then act boldly." Evelyn was lying idly on the bed when David appeared in the ward. Her only advantage over many of the other patients was that her younger sister May had arranged for her to have a separate apartment with cozy furnishings, a large television set, and bouquets of fresh flowers in elegant vases. You wouldn't know it was a hospital. It had a homely atmosphere. David had no plan to bring the woman out of her deepest stress. He stared at the pretty patient in silence for a moment, then suddenly decided to sit down and tell her about his personal experience. In the middle of his monologue, Evelyn changed her position and turned round to face him. At the end, she asked him a question in a muffled voice. "And how did you, doctor, manage to cope with the inner emptiness and acute loneliness?" David, without hesitation, said, "I decided to dedicate myself to people who were also in the midst of hopelessness. I love my dog," Evelyn suddenly said, "but I can't afford to have a friend at home. My business involves constant traveling. I won't be in treatment forever." David had an idea. "You know, Evelyn, my close friend Christian runs a dog shelter with his parents. I'll talk to your doctor today. Maybe he'll let you and I go there together." The woman smiled miserably. "I'll be grateful to you, David, and I promise I won't make any more attempts to collect more pills, to drink them all at once. When you're alone with a big grief, people around you are just as serene. It starts to feel like you've been dealt such a terrible fate. Your story showed me that there is a lot of grief around. It's just that people live in it like a tough shell, not showing the world what hell is going on inside them." A fortnight later, Evelyn was discharged from the dispensary. During this time, they had already made 2 trips with David to the shelter, where the woman couldn't resist taking home a large Labrador puppy. "You know, David," she shared with her handler on the way back, "I've decided to make a radical change in my life. I'm no longer attracted to my cosmetics business. I've already offered to buy out my salon chain to a longtime competitor." I'm sure she won't miss this chance to get her hands on a place that's popular with women. And I got the idea to set up my own kennel. I want to breed pedigree Labradors to give people the joy of communication with these wonderful dogs. The head doctor of the dispensary congratulated David on his first victory. He added that almost every ward of the medical center needs such a soulful, individual approach. How many destinies, broken lives can be redirected with simple words? What new horizons can a person who believes in himself again reach? He pondered aloud. Then there were many young and old who were able to accept grief and move on, and those who were never able to come to terms with the misfortune that had befallen them. David's tactics were always the same. He tried to reliably switch the person to something very important, very interesting, to leave no chance to get off the new path. There were failures in his work, but on the whole, the method worked amazingly well. A mother who lost her son and fell into a deep depression, he arranged to volunteer in an orphanage. A lonely old maid who had long ago lost hope for personal happiness after the death of her mother was assigned as an apprentice to a master in men's haircuts. A year later, she met in the salon with a single father with 2 children. Now she lives happily ever after. That's how David walked through life, helping those suffering to get rid of the oppression of circumstances without looking back. At first, he treated Barbara and Emma with condescension, taking them for just another unattached, but spoilt young ladies who had had a lot of injustice in their lives. Barbara shuddered with fear for a long time, and if someone knocked on the gate, she waited for Calvin's remorse and forgiveness. Then she decided to go to correspondence school. The once burning desire to study classical English literature somehow subsided. Later, David generally convinced her that with such a love for children from her will be an excellent teacher of Russian language and literature. After her maternity leave, he advised her to change her specialization and devote herself to pedagogy. Emma, and Dave, as she called him briefly, was also very fond of him. With his help, she learned to get out of her wheelchair and back into it easily, and to move around the house and garden a little on her own. However, she still preferred her mentor to be somewhere near her. Barbara's belly had already rounded up considerably. She was a couple of months away from giving birth. Winter was over, with all its long, magical holidays. Spring was blooming with the blossoming of fruit trees. The day was getting longer and the nights seemed shorter. David found himself looking forward to Tuesday more and more often. He couldn't wait to see Barbara again. Suddenly, he found himself watching her as she poured his coffee, sliced apples for jam, and did her simple hairdo. This young woman seemed so cozy and homely to him. At times, Barbara would fall silent, as if listening to herself, trying to determine what her long-awaited baby was doing. Then her face would always light up with a smile, and David would avert his eyes in embarrassment, thinking that she looked like Madonna, as innocent and perfect. After a while, the man realized it had happened. He had fallen in love again with Barbara, who was due to give birth in a couple of weeks. He didn't share his feelings. This young woman had already gone through the betrayal of a loved one and was able to overcome it honorably. But David was not sure that in Barbara's soul there was no hope that her husband would come at least to meet her from the maternity hospital to see her son. The ultrasound had long ago revealed that Barbara was having a boy, and she hoped he would mellow out and want to be near his family. Calvin hadn't shown up once in all this time. Only his parents came to visit with an unexpected offer to sell the flat and return the money invested in it to Barbara's parents. The boy would have to be raised, brought up, educated. The mother-in-law considered her decision wise and logical. Barbara herself remained silent during this conversation. David was right, she still hoped in her heart that time could be turned back. Despite the fact that, according to her mother-in-law, Calvin was already living with another woman. She knew her husband well. He'd made a mistake, fallen for some other woman. She's pregnant, not so attractive now. Vain hopes, vain tears in the pillow at night, a woman's loneliness. Calvin lived for his own pleasure, barely remembering his family. Calvin and May initially hid their relationship from the man's parents for a long time. At his request, May pursued with persistence the cherished goal of winding up and marrying Calvin. She sat by his side when he needed to do his studies. Although she was a year older, May successfully defended her degree and got a job as an aspiring economist in a small firm. Calvin passed the session, moved to the final year, became a good employee in a law firm, where he recently got a part-time job. Now he was an assistant lawyer on family cases there on full rights of a staff member. In the law firm, no one guessed that career success clever Calvin was due to a quiet, modest, but clearly talented guy who came to the lawyers to practice. The newcomer had a phenomenal instinct for successful, profitable deals. He did not get involved in the cases himself, but a couple of times hinted to Calvin for which divorce proceedings should be taken up and which litigation companies to join. Having already won twice in complex litigation, Calvin suggested to the chief the best line of behavior. He was going to take his new girlfriend May somewhere in Turkey, Tunisia, or Egypt. Suddenly he was shocked to hear from his own mum. "Son, I turned a blind eye to your relationship with May. I thought you would come to your senses and think about it. But my hopes were not fulfilled. There's not much time left before our grandson is born. Father and I don't want to be mean and greedy people. I'll give you a week to vacate the flat. We'll sell it. It is decided to give all the money to your wife to support the boy." Looking ahead, we can tell you that Calvin's conscience about welcoming his wife and son from the maternity hospital did not even think of waking up. On the day of the birth of his child, he slept serenely at home. The holidays after the session were in full swing. Then he went to the supermarket to buy a couple of bottles of wine for dinner. That evening, Calvin had his first nervous conversation with May. She was so used to living in a spacious two-bedroom flat that she didn't want to move the two of them into her studio flat. From here, her work was within walking distance. The infrastructure here wasn't the same as near her own flat on the outskirts. Another ultimatum appeared in Calvin's piggy bank. "We've been together for over 6 months, honey. It's time to make a decision. What are your plans for me? If we are to have a real family, not just a cozy pastime, you will take responsibility and provide your woman with both a place to live and means to live. Exactly a trouble-free existence." The man was at first a little taken aback by such a statement, but then he remembered a busy conversation with a talented trainee. In his mind, he instantly conceived a plan to earn a decent sum of money for at least a year of the life to which May was accustomed. He could no longer do without this resourceful person, hot, beautiful companion at all the parties in their youth group, surprisingly even sometimes a good hostess. Calvin had no way of knowing that May's friend's cleaning company did the cleaning in his flat, and that the pickles in the fridge came from orders placed at cafes and restaurants. "There will be a beautiful life for you, and there will be prosperity," Calvin proudly replied to his friend. Inappropriately recalling the children's poem "The Old Man," which his mother liked to read to him before bedtime, Calvin said, "I have a plan. I'm sure it will work." May's gratitude gave Calvin even more confidence that the plan would go well. The next day he didn't go to work, he ran there. Calvin's plan was simple. Yesterday, stammering, blushing and pale, an intern had told him that a client had made him an indecent proposal. Calvin had thought at first that the customer's outburst was of a different nature, but it turned out to be otherwise. The client offered the guy to steal one of the documents in the case of divorce proceedings with his wife. Deprived of such a strong argument, the woman was losing everything. The proud young employee rejected the offer with indignation, and Calvin decided to take advantage of it. Contacting the unscrupulous mate was easy. All his contacts were on file, as they should be. Calvin set up a meeting with the slippery fellow in a cafe on the other side of town. He did the deed. Then it was over. Inexperienced in such matters, the employee of the law firm did not take into account only one nuance: the wife of the scoundrel was not a bad guy either. She has long ago hired a private investigator who constantly monitored the movements of almost ex-spouse. Further could unfold a fascinating story. The offended woman was like a wildcat. She appeared in front of the spouse at the moment of the exchange. Angered by the perfidy, the wife did not come alone, but with the press, and in the evening stories about the corruption of the lawyer's world were shown on all the local news channels. Calvin's name was instantly blacklisted from all legal services. To get a job in his profession he could now only somewhere in Zimbabwe, and even then unlikely. Calvin's parents raised all their connections, trying to hush up a criminal case on several articles at once. Calvin was facing serious charges. He didn't get away with it. Given the large size of the reward, the court sentenced him to 2 years imprisonment in a penal colony with a substantial fine. May, who had unwittingly inspired Calvin's aspirations to get a lot of things at once, vanished from his flat in an instant. Ubiquitous journalists quickly found the girlfriend of the hero of the day, but she refused to comment, muttering a pre-prepared phrase. No comment. Barbara learned about what happened to her husband much later from his parents, who brought money and gifts for their recently born grandson. Named Christian after his grandfather, the baby never learned that his birth father had not wanted him before he was born, and later ended up in prison for dishonest intentions to enrich himself without labor. On the day that little Christian was born, Barbara was driven to the hospital in a car David had recently acquired in an amazing way. The doctor had an almost fantastic story with this car. He lived in average conditions, wrote his PhD thesis, worked extensively with patients in the city and region, but never charged inflated fees for his appointments. Everything according to the price list of the clinic. Once a very old grandmother from a distant village turned to him. Her grandson was a biker and had crashed his motorbike. The old woman could not forgive herself that God had taken him young and left her, the owner of the gorgeous flower beds. The flowers were still growing and blooming, but her own child was gone. It took David more than one session with Granny and the gardener to turn her attention back to the flowers that needed care. The last time he was about to leave for the train, Grandma stopped him. "Son, wait. I have one more thing to do for you. Hold the paper. You read it carefully." David's eyes widened when he saw the contents of the document on letterhead with watermarks. It was a gift deed in his name for a blue BMW car. "Yeah, no," David said, embarrassed by this. David bought it from his grandmother, who and her grandson lived alone in the whole wide world. He's a loner. "I'm an old lady, God's dandelion. His parents died. I brought him up. He is late, they had a child. They all traveled around the world to Elbrus, and in their box traveled. My grandson wasn't poor, he was a businessman. This is his car, just for the parade. He used it. All on this iron friend of his, until it ruined him. You use it, son. I had a neighborhood officer help me with the paperwork. It's all according to the law." And that's how Dr. David got a shiny blue car. After the discharge, Barbara was welcomed by the whole team. Amanda, Bridget, and her family came to the village to celebrate the occasion. Christian, Olivia, and Emma stood with large bouquets of flowers. And David held a cake for the staff and a bundle of colorful inflatable balloons. Barbara froze with a bundle with a baby in her arms and admired him fondly against the clear azure sky. He looked very cute in his new light-colored shirt with the collar open. Suddenly, one of the red balloons, painted with hearts, burst with a deafening sound. Barbara laughed and suddenly realized that she no longer loved her husband Calvin. The magic was over. The last illusions melted away. After serving his sentence, Calvin returned to the city. He did not like to talk about his stay in prison. On all questions, parents answered sparingly. He was now legally unable to get a job as a lawyer. May changed her phone number. Through mutual acquaintances, he learned that she was about to marry some fashion designer with great prospects. Emma was upbeat. She had long ago disproved the doctor's assumptions that she was destined for a short life. The villagers still came to her to look into her kind eyes and believe in a bright future. She paid attention to everyone. She was still the sunny little girl that Betty the witch doctor saw in her. David and Barbara had a daughter, Megan, a year ago. There was no other name for her, her parents had decided. Dr. David has finally moved to the village, settling into his inpatient office. Now people from both the city and the region were coming to see him. Calvin carefully washed a window in the restaurant, fulfilling the task of the cleaning company, which he miraculously managed to get a job in. A chance meeting with May's friend, who had been in the cleaning business for a long time, had helped. This young lady was once very jealous of May and had a little crush on her handsome boyfriend. Now Calvin has already lost his former gloss, has become somehow vague and shabby. A woman's heart is not made of stone. The owner of the cleaning company really needed a tall, strong worker, not afraid of heights. Her female employees were afraid of working at heights. Word of mouth, she offered Calvin the vacant position. He enthusiastically accepted. I must say, he was surprisingly fast and high quality, as if he was born for this job. Now the man in overalls, carefully rubbing the shiny surface with a special compound, began to rub the formed deposit of thick white foam over the entire area of the glass. A blue foreign car pulled up in front of the restaurant. An imposing man came out of the saloon, holding the hand of a boy of about 3 or 4 years old. Next to him, a lovely woman with a little girl in a beautiful dress in her arms stood proudly. Calvin couldn't believe his eyes at first. It was his ex-wife Barbara, but so charming, full of aristocratic dignity. And when he thought, "We have English roots, hence the lords and ladies. Misty Albion." No wonder he splashed the foam on the glass once more, endeavoring to rub the surface of it to an incredible luster. It seemed to him now that this was his way of washing his tangled soul. He had once dropped his dignity, his happiness, and his future to the ground. Would he be able to pick it up? A widow with many children was weeping bitterly at her husband's grave, and as soon as her shoulder was touched. For 4 years, Joyce had not believed in happiness. Once she had everything a woman could wish for: a loving husband, Albert, 3 wonderful children, a beautiful flat in the center, exotic trips once a year with the whole family to the end of the world, an expensive car. But everything changed dramatically when Albert died. The man was coming home late at night. A meeting had gone long. At work, he never particularly did not spare himself, realizing that a large family must be decently provided for. The job took up a lot of his time, but even with his busy schedule, he found days that he could devote to Joyce and the kids. That unfortunate night, Albert sat behind the wheel very tired. Their company was preparing for an important project, so the man hadn't slept much in the last few days. The road was empty, so at some point Albert relaxed and apparently lost his guard. He simply did not notice the impending danger. At the junction, a lorry slammed into him at full speed. There was no chance of survival. Looking at the traffic camera footage, Joyce realized that if Albert had slowed down for even a fraction of a second before the junction, the terrible tragedy would have been avoided. Inattention and fatigue were to blame, as well as the lorry driver who had arrogantly hoped to run through the junction on red. There's no point in blaming anyone now. Albert can't be brought back. It took Joyce a long time to accept what had happened when she received a call from the police. The woman was convinced that she had been the victim of a prank or fraudsters who swindled gullible relatives out of money by reporting trouble with family members. But something in the caller's tone alerted her. Senior Lieutenant Morris, as the man had introduced himself, was waiting for her at the district morgue. It took Joyce 10 minutes to get there, almost getting into an accident on the way. She entered the building on woozy legs. "This is crazy," the woman told herself. "This is a mistake. Albert's at work. He just got held up." and the fact that the phone was silent was just to keep her busy. Joyce, a man's voice called out to her. Turning round, Joyce saw a young boy standing in front of her. If he hadn't unfolded the law enforcement badge, she would never have believed he was an officer. Joyce, Senior Lieutenant Morris, continued. "My name is Ethan. You and I have been chatting on the phone." Yes, Joyce responded uncertainly. "Where is he? Ethan, can I see him?" "Perhaps that's not the best idea," the young man replied, somehow embarrassed. "You see, the accident is terrible. There's hardly anything left of the car. And your husband. I've called you in now, rather to identify your personal belongings. I don't think it's wise to identify a body in your condition." Everything inside clenched. Joyce didn't understand how anyone could speak so callously about her husband. She still held out hope that someone else had died. There weren't many other Albertans in their big city. The policeman led the woman into a small room. Another young man sat at a desk, concentrating on typing something into his phone. Kyle Morris addressed him. "Get the evidence bag." Kyle lazily pulled open a desk drawer and extracted a clear plastic bag containing some red-stained items. "Here, Joyce, take a look at this." Ethan began laying the contents out on the table. "Do you recognize any of these items?" She was about to declare, without looking, that this was the first time she'd ever seen any of this. But then the gold pendant she'd given her husband on their wedding anniversary caught her eye. The woman reached for the shiny rectangle, but her legs gave out. Ethan managed to pull up a chair for her. Everything in front of Joyce's eyes swam. She drank the water offered by the policeman. "Yes, those are my husband's things," the woman spoke in a trembling voice. "We need to make our way to the station now, fill out paperwork, and watch the security footage," Morris addressed her. Joyce didn't care anymore. Her whole world had collapsed overnight. What did she care about paperwork? She had fallen into a kind of half-remembered oblivion and reacted to the words of the staff, clutching Albert's pendant tightly in her hand. All she cared about now was how to tell her children that their daddy was gone. After the funeral, Joyce had stopped caring about what was going on around her. The children were looked after by a nanny, and Joyce herself began to drink in secret. To the housekeeper's criticism of her constant pulling of bottles out of the bin, the woman did not react. She locked herself in her room and spent long hours looking at pictures of their once happy family. This went on for months. Waking up on a frosty winter morning with a severe headache, Joyce felt as if she had woken up. She looked around at the mess around her and cried. Only now did she finally realize that Albert would never again come into their bedroom, hug her, or call her to eat the cheesecakes he always made for the family on weekends. When the woman left the room, the first thing she did was head to the kitchen. Everyone in the house was still asleep. The clock showed only the beginning of 7. Joyce was determined to prepare her husband's speciality. Her relaxed body didn't obey her. It was only on the 3rd attempt that she managed to knead the dough. When the last cheesecake was transferred from the pan to the plate, Catherine came into the kitchen. Her eldest daughter was 8, but she was remarkably advanced for her age. "Mummy?" the little girl wondered. "Are you up already?" "Yes," Catherine, the woman, tried to smile and hugged her daughter tightly. "I wasn't feeling well, but I'm fine now." "You made Daddy's cheesecakes," Catherine wondered. Of all the children, she was the only one to realize that her father was gone. James, who was only 5, cried for a long time, but he couldn't understand what was happening. Elizabeth was just a baby, unable to comprehend such information. "Mummy, are we going to have things back to normal now?" Catherine asked hopefully. "Yes, Catherine," Joyce sighed heavily. "It won't be the same. But we're strong, aren't we? We'll try to manage somehow." Catherine sat looking at her mother with a confused look. The girl could hardly believe her words. The woman had lost a lot of weight. Always neat, stylish hair turned into some kind of crow's nest. Under the eyes, darkened horrible circles. Her hands were treacherously shaking. "You know what?" Joyce suddenly suggested. "Why don't we have a beauty day this morning? Just the two of us." They used to have this kind of entertainment regularly, having been the first in the family. Catherine had everything a little girl could want. Therefore, hearing her mother's proposal, the daughter, without hesitation, agreed. While they were talking, James and Elizabeth entered the kitchen, accompanied by Cassandra and the Harrison family's invariable nanny. His brother held the little girl's hand with care, leading her like a princess. "Mammy," the little one shouted with glee as they embraced her. They were used to seeing their mother in the kitchen in the mornings. Joyce rarely left the room, trying not to let the children notice her condition. "My good ones." Joyce smiled as she hugged the little ones. "Good morning, Cassandra." "Good morning. I see you're in a good mood today," Cassandra replied gently. There was relief in the woman's eyes. She had been worried about Joyce lately. She had been working for the family for 8 years now. In that time, she had grown accustomed to everyone as family. With Albert's death, everything had changed. But watching Joyce fade away was unbearable. Cassandra had moved in willingly to help out and take on some of the responsibilities of a hostess. "Aunt Cassandra," Catherine said to Nanny, "Mummy and I are having a beauty day today." "Oh, you don't say, my dear. It's about time. It's better than being cooped up in 4 walls." After breakfast, Joyce and Catherine went on their beauty expedition, as they called their visit to the salon. Joyce was quickly tidied up and Catherine had her charming braids braided. However, there was a hitch at reception. "Ladies, the payment didn't go through," said the receptionist, smiling guiltily. "Let's try again. It happens sometimes." When the payment failed several more times, Joyce became seriously worried. Taking cash out of her purse, the woman paid. Getting into her car, she called the bank and reported her problem. Joyce, the employee, answered politely, "You see, the account to which your card is linked has been frozen. I can't give you the details over the phone. Come to the office." Joyce and Albert shared an account. The woman never gave much thought to how much money was in there, knowing her husband made a very good living. The message about the freeze left her confused. "Of course, it's some kind of technical glitch," the woman convinced herself. "Now I will go to the bank and find out everything." But the bank said nothing comforting. On the contrary, the situation seemed much worse. The account was arrested and blocked. Albert had some debts that Joyce had no idea about. "They never had any secrets from each other," the manager said monotonously. "Even if you inherit now, you can't unfreeze the account. By law, debts are inherited too. So what's left? Either sue, trying to recover the money, or accept it." Neither of which Joyce was happy with. Suddenly, fear came to her throat. "What is this?" the woman thought with horror. "There's no money. What am I supposed to do now?" Joyce had never worked, having been fortunate enough to marry a wealthy and promising man. A student, Joyce initially worked part-time as a translator, dreaming of a career as an international translator. But her husband was adamant. "I am capable of providing for you so that you will not deny yourself anything for the rest of your life." Joyce never went to work, and then Catherine appeared, and the woman devoted herself entirely to her family. Joyce grinned. For the rest of her days. Who knew how things would turn out? Right now, the woman was concerned about the children. Of course, there was some cash at home, and the jewelry could be sold. Enough for the first time, but money was running out at supersonic speed. Used to living large, Joyce didn't know where her finances were going. At some point, she suddenly realized that she had run out of money altogether. The jewelry had been sold. The contents of her husband's safe were rapidly melting away. There was nothing to do. so she went to Cassandra for advice. Cassandra, the woman, began softly, stepping noiselessly into the kitchen, where the nanny was preparing something. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Joyce, why are you so frightened?" The lady standing at the cooker literally jumped up and down. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Joyce tried to justify herself. "I've got something to talk to you about." "Yes," the nanny said, wiping her hands on her apron and sitting down at the table. Joyce didn't know where to begin. But there was no one closer than Cassandra right now. She was the only person Joyce could talk to normally. "Cassandra, I don't have any more money on me," she began. "What do you mean, Joyce?" And the woman looked at her understandingly. "What do you mean you don't have any?" "I always thought Albert was earning enough to give your grandchildren a good old age." He did. Joyce sighed. But he had some debts. Huge debts. "I've been to the bank and all the accounts are blocked. I've been spending the cash in the safe for 2 months now. I've sold most of my jewelry." "Joyce, are you serious now?" Cassandra exclaimed as if she couldn't believe it. "Why didn't you tell me before? It's not a minor problem. You have children." It was embarrassing. Joyce excused herself. "I've never been very good at counting money. It was Albert's job. He never let me in on things. Turns out money does run out. I don't know what to do now." "You have to get a job before it's too late," Nanny said firmly. "A job?" "I've never had a job," Joyce replied. "You know, I got married straight out of college. Albert wouldn't let me earn my own money." "Well, you have a good specialty," Cassandra said. "There's always a need for translators." Cassandra didn't give up. "Where would they take me? I graduated 10 years ago. No experience, nothing." Joyce disagreed. "It's okay," the nanny continued. "Work on the internet. I think translations are always in demand. Anyway, you never know without trying." "That's true," Joyce sighed. "Do you think it pays all right?" "It's all right. It's not all right. It's enough to live on. You'll have to tighten your belts, of course, but it's up to you, you know. I won't leave you in the lurch, but it's time you got things under control." "Hello, Martin." Joyce was visibly agitated as she dialed the number of her husband's friend and companion. "This is Joyce Harrison," she introduced herself. "Joyce, hello. Where have you been?" The man was very surprised. "I rang. You didn't answer the phone. I haven't seen you since the funeral." "Well, you know, I was in such a state I didn't want to see anyone." Joyce sighed heavily. "Martin, I need to talk to you. It's a serious problem. I think you can help me." "No problem," Martin answered in a confident tone, giving Joyce hope. Half an hour later, Martin was in the flat. It had been 6 months since he had visited his friends. Without Albert here, everything seemed somehow alien. The men had been friends since high school. They'd been through a lot. They opened their own business, shared both profits and losses. After the wedding, Albert was a little distant, but Martin did not take offense. He understood everything. He had no family of his own. His personal life was replaced by his favorite job. Joint business did not connect them for a long time. He accumulated capital. Albert went on a solo voyage, engaged in real estate, and Martin remained a small businessman. But doing what he loved, it didn't affect their friendship. "What happened to you?" the man asked. Martin, Joyce began. "Tell me, did you know anything about Albert's business?" "What do you mean?" "Well, I was at the solicitor's yesterday. I'm about to inherit the estate. It's been 6 months. I've got to make it official." Joyce suddenly stammered. And Martin didn't quite understand what she was getting at, or what it was about the inheritance. What's the next step? Isn't it a joy to get millions and not know where to put it? So she turned to an old friend for help. Joyce continued. "No," Joyce said in a tone that alerted Martin. "You see, Albert had huge debts. He never said anything to me about it. So I was wondering if you knew anything. They showed me some papers, some loans, some private loans, some receipts. And now I've got to pay it all back, you know. What are you talking about? Martin was genuinely surprised. What debts? I always thought that you were doing very well. I was jealous, to be honest. So? It's a lot of money. Astronomical. I don't understand it myself. I thought he was making good money. I spoke to Jack, his assistant, well, he told me that Albert had been really looking to expand lately. He's probably got the money to do it. I just can't understand why he didn't do it on behalf of the company. I take it you're worried, Martin said, and how much is there to pay? A lot to pay out, Joyce sighed. They've blocked all the accounts, but I'm still short. I think I'm going to have to sell the flat. Really? Martin was genuinely surprised. The sum seemed to be really impressive. In his estimation, the Harrison flat was worth a lot. Center, prestigious building, huge space, designer finishes. Joyce had told him how much he needed to pay off his debts. Martin even whistled in surprise. Tell me, will you help me with the deal? Joyce asked. I don't know anything about this sort of thing. I'm afraid of running into crooks and losing the price. No problem, Joyce said persuasively. Tell me, where are you going to live? Maybe a cheaper option. I realize you're used to luxury, but you don't have much choice now. As they say, it's not a matter of living large, it's a matter of living well. Of course, Martin, I've had to say goodbye to luxury, Joyce agreed. And it would be nice to have enough for a 2-bedroom in the suburbs. There are 4 of us, after all, but there's no need to consider a decent one. I understand, Martin nodded. I'll try to find suitable options. All right, I'll get started right away so it won't take too long. Let me take a picture of the flat. I've got a good realtor in the neighborhood. He won't let you down. Mammy James interjected, "Where's my room?" "This is where you and Catherine will live." Joyce opened the door to the tiny bedroom. "We'll put the beds here, and there's a table and a wardrobe." "No, I don't want to live with Catherine. She's mean and greedy. I want my room back." The little boy whimpered. "Honey, we're going to live here now. Don't you love it? Look how green the yard is. You'll even have your own tree." By your own tree, Joyce meant a huge cherry tree, whose branches were literally breaking through the window of the future nursery. "And Elizabeth?" James persisted. "Elizabeth will live with me. There's plenty of room for us." Trying to smile, Joyce answered her son. Catherine entered the room. The girl's face showed that she was not happy about her new home either. "Mama," she began, "tell me, are we poor now?" "What are you saying?" Joyce tried to evade, though she knew it was useless to deceive her daughter. "Well," Catherine looked at her seriously, "the whole flat is smaller than our kitchen. And we drove an hour to get here. Why are we moving?" "Mummy, I'm not stupid. Just tell it like it is." Joyce took her daughter aside. She didn't want James to get hysterical when he caught some of the phrases. "Daughter," she began, "I don't want to deceive you. You're right, we don't have any more money. It's just the way things are. But now we have to learn to live again. I had to sell the flat. A lot of things will change. But the important thing is to stay together. Isn't it?" Joyce looked hopefully at her daughter. The girl's mind was going through an intense process. She seemed to be relating what she had heard to everything that had happened lately. For a moment, her eyes lit up. "Aunt Cassandra isn't coming back, is she?" Catherine asked disappointedly. "If we don't have any more money, we won't be able to pay her." "Catherine," Joyce hastened to reassure her. "Cassandra won't leave us. We're like family to her. It's just that we will see her less often because she will have to work somewhere else. But she'll be happy to come round at weekends, won't she?" Who's going to look after Elizabeth and James then? Whilst at school, the girl asked. Well, I'm working at home for the time being, and then I'm thinking of putting them in kindergarten, her mother said with sincere faith in her voice. And you yourself are ready to move to a new school? Continued questioning Catherine. Mummy, I understand everything. I'm already quite big, she said in a serious tone. What does it matter where to study? I can think for myself. Sometimes Joyce was amazed at how mature her daughter was. They couldn't afford the old grammar school. Thank goodness they had managed to get the child into a neighborhood school, which was really quite good. But still it is a stress for the girl, accustomed to classmates and individual approach of teachers. And with kindergarten for the younger ones, it was necessary to solve something. It turned out that it was not enough just to bring the children. The queue was huge, and Joyce could not afford a private institution. The cost of attendance seemed exorbitant. And then there were the two children. Cassandra's services, of course, had to be dispensed with as well. The kind woman had agreed to help with the household chores, but Joyce felt she had no right to exploit her all the time. She managed to find some work, but translations from French were of little interest now. Everywhere there was a need for specialists in Asian languages, of which the former student had only a vague idea. Anything she could earn was gone in a flash. The money left after paying all Albert's debts was barely enough for a small flat in a residential area and a small reserve, which Joyce put aside for the last resort. There was still a car, but a woman with 3 children didn't want to deprive herself of mobility, although the maintenance of a premium car also cost a lot of money. Attempts to get an official job as an interpreter in an international company failed. Seeing a spectacular, well-dressed woman, job seekers managers willingly escorted her to their offices, but her lack of experience and 3 children immediately turned them against Joyce. After a few such interviews, she gave up trying. Such conversations hurt her ego. So, and remained, in his opinion, forced to work part-time casual translations of modern French authors. The editor was in no hurry to pile orders, so the cash flow in the family did not turn into a stormy river. 6 months after the move, Joyce realized that the money is catastrophically lacking. She still had to sell the car, exchanging it for a simpler car. The school Catherine went to, although it was not elite, still required huge expenses. They were constantly collecting money for repairs, for gifts for teachers, for something else. The last thing Joyce wanted was for her classmates and teachers to be prejudiced against Catherine because of her family's difficult financial situation, so she paid all the exorbitant fees. That's the way it is in all schools, Judy, an old friend who was one of the few people Joyce kept in touch with after her husband Albert's death, once said. The rest of her friends had evaporated as soon as they felt there were no benefits to be gained from their relationship with Albert. And the widow might ask the widow for a loan. No one was in any hurry to part with the money. Joyce was a proud person, but nobody cared much about that aspect. So she was left with her university friend Judy, Martin, and Cassandra. They supported the single mom as best they could. But in today's world, it's hard enough to stay afloat without a financial backstop. You know what, Joyce? Judy continued. I've got an acquaintance who's opening a private kindergarten with some experimental methods of education. Not many clients yet, as the prices aren't too steep. Maybe I could put in a good word with her about your kids. She is a person who understands, responsive, and in trouble will not abandon. I think we can negotiate a discount. You still have to find a job, no matter what. With the kids at home, it's out of the question. That's true, Joyce thought. But I doubt if I can afford even a small amount of money. Please leave that to me, said Judy. I'll arrange it. We'll make it all right. I can't help you with the job, unfortunately. You know I'm not very good at it myself. Just as Judy had said, the owner of the daycare center had come to an agreeable arrangement. Joyce was relieved to trust the children to this woman, who, as it turned out, lived nearby and even offered to bring them home. Joyce immediately started looking for a job, hoping for some prestigious, high-paying position. It didn't work out. First, she got a job as an administrator in a beauty parlor, but she couldn't work there for a month. The relationship with the owner, who for some reason immediately disliked the newcomer, did not work out. Joyce did not have any working specialty, although there were a lot of similar vacancies, and the salary was promised to be good. There were still options, which the woman was prevented from considering by her pride. But could a person with a higher education go as a cashier or food packer in a supermarket? Joyce tried delivery, so popular with the younger generation, but after a few orders brought to her old acquaintance, she gave up the idea. And it was costing a lot of money in petrol. "Joyce, let's go to my office," as a manager Martin once suggested to her when he dropped in for tea. "We've got a girl going on maternity leave. I wouldn't want to bring in someone from outside. It's not a difficult job. Of course, I can't offer you a huge salary, but a full social package. Weekends like normal people, free meals." "Sure, I'll go," Joyce agreed without hesitation. That's how she joined Martin's firm. Things were not going well at the new place. No, the woman coped with her duties in full. But relations with her co-workers had been frayed from day one. All the women working for Martin were convinced that Joyce got her position because of the chief's favor. Some ladies were openly jealous of her striking appearance and were quick to invent another unflattering gossip about her private life. But Joyce paid no attention. All she was interested in was how to feed herself and her children. Besides, her job left her enough time to do translations. However, the woman had no weekends at all. Even joint walks with the kids remained only a dream. Thank God, Cassandra came to the rescue, helping to make ends meet. Joyce had learned to live without her husband. "Mummy," Catherine said from the doorway when she saw Joyce staring at her laptop. "I don't think you've forgotten, but I'll remind you. James turns 9 this Sunday, and we haven't even bought him a present yet." It's like Joyce woke up. "Are you serious? Sunday already? What's the date today?" "Oh, Mum, you're so funny," she marveled at her daughter. "Greetings to distant space travelers from Earthlings. On our planet today is Tuesday, the 4th of September. The time is 1837. "I'm really confused about the days at work," Joyce confessed. "It's been a nightmare today, and I've got a translation due. I couldn't get round to it." Joyce seemed exhausted. In the 4 years she had spent as a widow, a lot had changed in her life. She still worked for Martin. She was no longer the office manager, but his personal assistant. Her salary was rising in line with inflation. Joyce still hadn't learned how to cope with the problem of being broke. Catherine had become a teenager with growing needs. James had already started 3rd grade, and Elizabeth would be starting school next year. Joyce worked hard to give her children everything they needed. But quality clothes and newfangled gadgets cost a lot, and the woman did not want her favorite offspring to stand out from their peers. Of course, Catherine constantly argued with her in the shop, choosing things simpler and cheaper. But Joyce couldn't be persuaded. "Let me finish early tomorrow," her mother continued. "You and I will go shopping and pick out something interesting. Do you know what he'd like?" "Oh, Mum," Joyce. "Shame on you. You've forgotten all about us. You don't even know what your son is interested in." That's it, said Catherine. "I'm joking. I understand perfectly well. You're not a little girl, I know everything. I'll show you when we get there. We'll have to stop by the Albion shop." "All right, my daughter, whatever you say," gave up mother. "There should be enough money. I hope I've been saving." Catherine vanished out the door, leaving Joyce alone with her thoughts. 4th of September, the woman reflected. After all, the day after tomorrow will be 4 years since he's been gone. We'll at least have to go to the cemetery. Joyce went to her husband's grave once a year. She couldn't stand it any longer. To see his smiling face etched on the black granite slab. She couldn't. Immediately, A heavy wave of memories of the past came crashing down on the equally hard granite of the present. She had never taken the children with her. Only once Catherine had traveled with her, but seeing her daughter's tears was even more unbearable than her husband's stony smile. After leaving work early, Joyce took her usual route. Martin, having learnt where his assistant was going, offered to give her a lift. But it was important for Joyce to make the journey alone. There were no traffic jams yet, so she reached the cemetery quickly. On the way, she stopped at a flower shop and bought 4 snow-white roses tied with black satin ribbon. The shop assistant smiled sympathetically at her, adding even more tragedy to the situation. At the cemetery gate, Joyce did not see the typical picture of peddlers soliciting paper flowers. The beggars and cripples that usually sat along the paths were not present on a weekday. Only the sounds from the granite workshop and the few wreaths gathered near the entrance reminded her that this place still had something to do with the world of the living. Joyce walked with an uncertain gait, noting on the way the landmarks she remembered from her previous visits: the lush fence, the graves of some authority figure from the 90s, the sad angel mourning a 5-year-old girl who had left the world, a rubbish bin topped with a pile of colored funeral wreaths. Spotting a bifurcated birch tree, the woman turned onto the path on the right. "Here we go, just a little further and I'll be there," Joyce thought, sinking her heels into the soft ground. The birch trees were already beginning to turn yellow. Ahead could be seen a granite slab gleaming in the sun, casting a sort of sombre golden glow. 2 huge ravens sat on the table, eating something left over from an offering to the dead with gusto. There were plastic bottles lying everywhere, wilted flower heads, dry branches. "Doesn't anyone really clean up around here?" Joyce thought. "Is it so hard to take the rubbish away with you?" "Well, here I am," she said in a shaky voice, squatting down in front of the ever-smiling Albert. "I'm sorry I'm alone and haven't been here in a while, love. I brought flowers. I know you didn't like them much, but it's tradition." With those words, Joyce put the roses in a jar of water, putting aside the withered remains of the ones from last time. "And the children are all grown up now. Catherine's a real bride. You wouldn't even recognize her. She looks just like you." The woman pulled out her phone and started flipping through pictures of the kids. "James is 9 now. Yesterday I went with Catherine to pick out a present for him. You'd think your son was into aeromodeling. They got him a plane like that. Catherine said he'd jump through the ceiling when he saw it, and Elizabeth is a year away from school. She's smart. She's already reading and writing. I even do French with her sometimes." Joyce sighed heavily, wiping away her tears with the palm of her hand. She didn't know what else to say to a dead man. All this superstition had never appealed to her. Even as a child, going to the cemetery with her relatives, she hadn't understood these meaningless conversations with the earth, libations of vodka on the grave, greetings and farewells. Well, a man is gone, he's gone. What can be done about it? What does he care about the survivors now? "How am I doing?" Joyce said, answering her own question, supposedly asked by the silent interlocutor. Same old, same old. I'm working for Martin. I don't know where we'd be now if it weren't for him. I don't make a lot of money, of course, but it's enough to live on. Cassandra's been very supportive. She's retired and often takes the younger ones to her cottage. I took them all summer, teaching them to garden. Elizabeth couldn't get out of the berry patch, and James has learnt to swim. I'm thinking of enrolling him in the pool. He needs sport anyway, Joyce said. For about 15 minutes, she sat in complete silence, immersed in her memories. The birdsong put her in a sort of meditative state. Suddenly, this calm was broken by a crackling noise. Joyce gave a startled shudder and looked round. An old man was standing not far from her, looking at her hesitantly. I'm sorry to startle you, the elderly man addressed Joyce peacefully. You see, it's Thursday. There's nobody here. And I'm lost again. I'm so lucky to have met you. No, not at all, the woman replied. You didn't scare me at all. I was just thinking and didn't expect anyone else to be here. Can I help you? If it's not too much trouble, could you help me find my wife's grave? It's been so many years and I keep getting lost in these gravestones. It's like she doesn't want me to see her like this, the old man smiled embarrassedly. Yes, of course, Joyce agreed, rising from the ground. Well, Albert, goodbye, I'll be off. I promise not to be discouraged. I'll give the children a hug. Joyce walked towards the old man, shaking off the hem of her cloak. She noticed he was holding a tiny bouquet of lavender. What a thing, she thought. I wonder where he found these flowers. And they don't look artificial. My name is Winston, the older man introduced himself. And I'm Joyce. Nice to meet you, Joyce, Winston said. I'm sorry we met in such a peculiar environment, the old man said apologetically. I see you're interested in my flowers. To be honest, yes, Joyce nodded. I didn't think you could find lavender in our town at this time of year. Even abroad, it's out of season. Are you interested? I am, Winston smiled. When my late wife and I went to Provence, we visited the lavender fields. The guide told us that these flowers are rarely found outside the country. They don't take root anywhere, that the climate is not suitable, or something else. So I was surprised it's just lavender. I grow them in my own greenhouse. All right, well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what about lavender? My wife was very fond of lavender, Winston said. I didn't share that sentiment, but I can't come here empty-handed. I'd like to make her happy. Mary, he corrected himself. Oh yes, the old man was worried. Let's try to find the tombstone. I used to turn off at that stone bollard over there, but it's all changed in a year. It's weird. I can't find a white marble monument, not very tall, and there's a wrought iron bench next to it. Mary. Joyce looked around. She'd never taken much interest in who was buried next to her husband. A couple of rows to the right, she spotted several similarly described monuments and immediately headed for them. On the third try, she found the right grave. Winston, she called out. I think I found it. Come here. The old man wandered slowly between the rows of graves, trying not to stumble on the grassy paths that were slippery from the recent rain. Hello, Mary, he said cheerfully, kneeling down on the ground. Again, you didn't want me to come, and very wrongly. You're always thinking of yourself. You know what? I'll find him. Joyce was looking at the photograph on the monument. It was of an elderly but strikingly beautiful woman. There was something subtly oriental about her appearance, and her eyes were laughing, filled with childlike joy. Judging by the date on the plaque, the woman had died 10 years ago, and also on the 6th of September. As you can see, Joyce thought, that's quite a coincidence. I wonder what it was from. She wasn't very old. She must have been ill. Suddenly, the old man's voice broke the silence and interrupted her thoughts. He spoke in French. The last thing Joyce had expected to hear was French poetry. Not just any poetry, but an extract from a famous poem by Arthur Rimbaud, to whom she had dedicated her thesis. Rolling tides and in winter's cold. I ran, baffled as the mind of children and peninsulas, breaking away from the land, had not learnt the triumph of such wild passions. By itself, Joyce's translation of the stanza spoken by Winston succeeded. The old man froze, slowly turned his head in her direction, and looked with surprise at the woman for whom it had cost nothing not only to recognize a rare poem, but also to reproduce it in Russian. Well, he said. I see you like Rimbaud? You see, Joyce replied, sitting down on the bench. When I was a student, I studied French, and this poem by Rimbaud was the subject of my thesis. I'm literally fascinated by this young poet, because he didn't have much else to write. And this poem left a significant mark on French poetry and literature in general. To say that I was surprised to hear it here now, and in excellent French is an understatement. Yes, Winston laughed. There are coincidences in life. And how can you not believe that everything in the world happens for a reason? Joyce, that poem. Mary was literally obsessed with it. My wife had an excellent knowledge of French, and as a young woman she was fond of translating the classics. Then one day she came across Rimbaud, and you realize how difficult it was to get hold of such literature, even for students. She read the translation, but it seemed to her that it did not convey the essence of the original, and Mary was a very persistent and determined girl. So she decided to create her own translation. I have an old notebook at home in which my wife wrote down her versions, but she was never able to perfect them, as she thought. It would be very interesting to see it, Joyce said. I touched on the subject of translation during the defense, but it was about the popular versions. I'm interested purely from a professional point of view. If you're really interested, then you're welcome to visit, Winston replied. I live alone. My son got married a long time ago and moved to the capital. He visits once every couple of years, Winston continued. I'm afraid to fly. I've never even seen my grandchildren in person. Mary's gone. I'm a recluse. My friends have all left this world long ago. If it's not too much trouble, come and see me. I live near the Central Library, you know. Maybe the house with the columns in the original? I know, Joyce smiled. The old man's offer might have seemed dubious to some, but the woman felt that the man was very lonely, and the sincerity with which he told her the details of his life was endearing. Besides, Joyce really wanted to look at Rimbaud's translations. Her professional interest was making itself felt. I'll definitely come. Let's do it tomorrow at 5 o'clock. It'll be convenient. I'll have a couple of hours to spare. Of course, assured her old man. Come, I'll treat you to a specialty coffee, a woman's recipe. I'll leave you my phone number. If anything changes, let me know. The new acquaintances stayed at the cemetery for some time, and then Joyce kindly offered to give Winston a lift home. All the way he told her about the peculiarities of growing flowers in the greenhouse. Joyce had never realized it could be so interesting. She returned home in high spirits. Catherine had already come home from school. We must eat quickly, Joyce said. Mother and daughter went to the kindergarten. Elizabeth managed to get into a fight with a boy who was pulling her braids. The conflict ended with a torn shirt. The child's angry mother demanded compensation from Joyce for the spoiled item. Unwilling to listen to an explanation, Joyce silently pulled out the money. Noticing that the purse was almost empty, she muttered. Yes, it's still a couple of days before payday. She didn't scold Elizabeth, noting only. A real lady would not defend her honor with her fists, but would seek revenge using her intelligence. How's that, Mummy? I don't understand. You and I will definitely talk about it, but a little later. But I'm still glad you didn't let yourself be offended. Mum, Catherine intervened in the conversation. Why did you give that bitch the money? It's clear that it's her child's fault. If you'd stayed out of it, you'd still be in one piece, Catherine said. Sometimes you have to give in, said the mother. I realize what a conflict would lead to now. We'd have a fight with her. She still won't admit that her son is at fault. After all, then I will question her love and methods of upbringing. And there's no way to prove anything to an offended soul. He'd end up attacking Alex again tomorrow, only with his mother's encouragement. And now we'll teach our princess how to take revenge on the offender without using fists, so that she won't bother again. And this, as you called her, bitch doesn't have enough brains to realize that her son was insulted. Well, Mum, Catherine stretched out, laughed. What a sly one you are. Having finished her work, Joyce remembered that she had promised to stop by Winston's. She called her eldest daughter and arranged for her to pick Elizabeth up from kindergarten, telling her that she would be a little late. Mum Catherine piped up, "Are you late for work or are you going on a date?" "What date, baby?" Joyce laughed. "I've got an appointment. I'll try not to be long. Okay?" "All right," Catherine whispered, "don't worry." Joyce bought some cakes on the way. She didn't want to go to the house empty-handed. She knew a good bakery that sold inexpensive but delicious sweets. She liked to take her children there when she had free time for a joint day off. The woman parked in front of the impressive stuccoed front door, noting that the house where the old man lived did not look simple, even by modern standards. In the old days, representatives of the ruling elite, diplomats, academics, high-ranking officials lived in such Stalinist high-rises. But today, only very wealthy people could afford a flat in such an architectural object. Winston lived on the 7th, top floor. Joyce took a rare lift with a sliding cast-iron grille and noticed the rich decoration of the stairwell. The walls were decorated with moldings, the marble floors were clean, and each door had a gilded plaque with the initials of the owners. When she rang the bell at the door that said Winston lived behind it, the woman waited a long time for the door to be opened. Winston greeted her with a broad smile. The old man was dressed in an immaculately tailored gray woolen suit that made him look much younger. "Good evening, dear Joyce." The man greeted her. "I didn't expect you to come." "Why not?" the woman asked, embarrassed. "Well, you'd have to admit, meeting in a cemetery is a rather dubious way to start a relationship," the older man smiled. "Though, considering the way life flows nowadays, it's surprising that strangers can even talk to each other and find a common theme." "I confess," Joyce replied, "I am driven by professional interest, and I'd like to try your advertised coffee. I've brought some cakes, too." "Thank you." Winston took the bundle of treats. "Please come in." Joyce walked into the huge living room. The flat had high ceilings of at least 4 meters. One wall of the spacious room was completely filled with shelves of books. On the shelves were whole collections of rare editions, which the owner of the library had collected for decades. There were even some ancient-looking medieval manuscripts and editions with traces of time on their covers. Apparently, the owner of the flat was a man extremely well-read. The order of the bookshelves made it clear that the contents were not just decoration or an attempt to impress. "I see you like my little collection?" Winston asked, bringing trays of coffee and sweets into the room. "It's quite small," Joyce said, still looking at the books. "There are at least 2,000 volumes here." 3,047. "To be exact," said the old man. "There were more, but when Mary died, I donated some of it to the university library, as she had willed. And now that I'm retired, I can't afford to read as much as I used to. My eyesight's not what it used to be." And it was more interesting to discuss what I read with Mary than to be alone with my opinions. Sometimes I'd open her favorite illustrated editions and just admire the drawings. Here, for example, Winston reached for one of the shelves, where there was a whole collection of brightly colored covers decorated with golden Arabic ornaments. Winston displayed Tales of 1001 Nights, an amazingly beautiful full-size book covered in silk with a glossy marbled insert depicting a tent in a flowering garden. "It's a 1913 French edition with illustrations," he said. "Oh my God, it's beautiful." Joyce marveled. "I'd never have realized that such copies were in private collections. It's a work of art." "You're right," smiled the old man. "Such collections can easily be sold at auctions for decent money. Today there are no more than 5 complete collections of such books, but I will not sell my fairy tales for any money. You see, they are not just well-preserved volumes, they are memories. Moments of happiness, forever gone, but also forever in my soul. Mary and I bought this collection in Paris, would you believe it, at a flea market, and for only 300 francs. Although at the time it seemed a fabulous sum to us. When Soviet citizens got to foreign countries, they bought everything that was different from their usual life. But for some reason, Mary and I did not go to fashionable shops and perfume shops, but went straight to hunting for antiques. The seller asked 400 francs for the books, but we had only 300 francs left. Seeing the fire in my wife's eyes, the merchant could not stand it and gave in. Probably then he regretted 1,000 times, because today the cost of such a collection is at least 30,000 euros. Oh, really? Joyce marveled. Is it really true? It's true, sighed the old man. So what good is money if you can't buy anything with it? Think about it. How can I, an old man, afford such a sum? It won't bring me joy. Shall I put it in the bank? What for? For a funeral, maybe. Because it's expensive. And it's expensive to send yourself to the next world for that kind of money. I'm not some pharaoh. Joyce laughed. Winston was right. She wondered what she would have done herself. If she owned such expensive books, she probably wouldn't hesitate to sell them. He's the one who doesn't need the money. Joyce has children to raise. Every penny counts. That kind of luxury is a thing of the past. What if the books belong to the children? Joyce wondered. Then, no, not at any price. It would be too low. She'd be better off scrubbing floors. She wouldn't sleep at night, but she wouldn't deny her family the right to such a treasure. Winston sipped his tea from a fine china cup. Oh, what lovely coffee! Joyce exclaimed. I've never tasted anything like it. I'm glad you appreciate my specialty recipe, laughed the old man, though it's not quite right to call it your own. I learned to make coffee this way from an old Arab named Amin. His coffee shop was located in one of the old neighborhoods. Arabs appreciate coffee. For them, it's not just a drink, but a whole culture. How interesting, Joyce exclaimed. Have you traveled a lot? A lot, Winston sighed. But Algeria is a special subject for Alice and me. You see, she was an interpreter at the embassy. She was sent to North Africa right after college. At that time, the Union was actively establishing relations with the Arab states. There weren't many specialists. That's where she and I met. And you're a translator too? Joyce was surprised. No, not at all, smiled the old man. I was an archaeologist. An archaeologist? Joyce marveled. Yes, I agree. It's not an ordinary profession, Winston replied. For a long time, our group had excavated all over the United States. My specialty is Orientalism. I lived in Uzbekistan for a long time. We found a lot of stuff there. But in the 70s, I received an unusual offer from my university to go to Algeria to excavate in Jamil. Of course, I agreed. It was practically impossible to go abroad at that time. I should not have refused such a chance. An interest, you can't deny it. But here we went to Africa. At first, of course, everything seemed wild, especially the unbearable heat and the absence of the usual amenities. We drove into the mountains. It was very hard to get there, and to be honest, it was scary. The very terrain and people were frightening, and our guide looked like a criminal. Jamil is an ancient Roman city. They began to study it in the early 20th century, so we were not pioneers. But we had to take into account that Algeria is not a developed country. No roads, no proper shops, and it's in the middle of nowhere. We had to carry all the luggage, provisions, and equipment on our backs. We had a few mules. I'm still amazed at how hardy they are. And Norman, the guide, even though he had a creepy appearance, turned out to be a reliable man. He saved us from many dangers. We were several months away from civilization, surrounded by ancient ruins. There were ghosts and creatures everywhere. But the scariest of all were the nights, or rather the cold that came with them. It's unbelievable when the temperature rises to +50 during the day and drops below 0 at night. In the mountains. Of course, it's a peculiar pleasure. But we were young and brave and obsessed with digging. How did you and your wife meet? Joyce asked. And Mary? Winston sighed. Mary and I first met when our group was on its way home. The old man drew in more air, as if preparing to dive underwater. After a long pause, he began his story. The excavations at Jamil were a success. Winston's group managed to find the remains of thermal baths and well-preserved mosaic floors. They even managed to get hold of a few clay jugs, which were quite well preserved. Such a find was rare, so the archaeologists were already preparing to rest on their laurels of glory, having taken several hundred pictures, published dozens of articles in magazines, and carefully packed their equipment. The group intended to make the return journey in the morning. The last night began as usual. At first it was sharply cold. The guys built fires, cooked dinner, and sat down to tell stories. Life stories quickly became boring. Then the interpreter Norman began to pester Sid to tell them something interesting about this place, something he had encountered himself. The guy did not agree for a long time, but after persistent persuasion and a couple of shots of vodka, his tongue was loosened. I had just started taking scientists to the ruins, Sid began. My first group was 4 young Frenchmen, Sid said. The War of Independence had just ended. The atmosphere here was not the most favorable, but I liked that these young people were free of prejudice and didn't hold their noses. There was a photographer among them. I think his name was Jean, though I could be wrong. They reached Jamil quickly. It was the beginning of September. It was not very hot during the day, so it was easy to walk. The boys set up camp at the site, and I went to harness the mules. "What's stopping us here?" Norman asked quickly. So it was decided to start the work in the morning. We were sitting by the fire, as we were now, and preparing to go to our tents. Suddenly, one of the guys noticed that Jean was gone. When the photographer left, no one noticed. At first, we thought he had gone to sleep in the tent. He didn't turn up. We went round the neighborhood, calling for him, trying to find him with torches, but no luck. The guy was gone without a trace. It's not hard to get lost here, but there's a risk of wandering into the mountains and falling into a crevasse. Sleep was out of the question. Every minute counted. We split into pairs and continued our search. Francois and I went into the mountains, and the other 2 lads went to explore the ruins. When dawn broke, my partner and I returned to camp. As we approached, Luke, one of the guys who had gone to the ruins, came running towards us. He was waving his arms and shouting at us to hurry up. We ran after him toward the amphitheater. There on the steps sat Eugene. His head was as white as chalk, though only yesterday he had been a burly brunette. He was frantically clutching his camera and muttering to himself the word Mopana. The guy seemed to be unable to see anyone or anything around him. His pupils were severely dilated and his lips were chapped. He did not respond to our words. We got him to the camp, gave him tea, and put him to bed. By morning he seemed to have regained consciousness, but he remembered nothing at all. Perhaps he had managed to photograph something, but I was not to find out. As soon as the guys left, I never heard from them again. Sam broke the silence around the fire. "You know, I went out of the tent last night to take a leak, and just in the area of the amphitheater I saw some kind of glow. I thought it looked like the moon was setting, even though it was overcast. What if it was haunted?" "That's a bit of a stretch," Sam said. "Norman, there's no such thing as ghosts." "Yeah, Winston, the leader of the group, said skeptically. He had always thought such stories were rubbish. He wasn't going to believe them, but he couldn't sleep well after what he'd heard. When all the boys had gone to their tents, Winston lay still for a long time, wondering what the Frenchman could have seen in the ruins that he had turned gray overnight. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by a crackling noise from the street. He poked his head out of the tent, but it was empty. Only the embers of the fire were slowly going out. He was about to climb back in when the crackling sound came again. The sound was loud and distinct, coming from the direction of the ruins. But no Winston muttered, climbing out of the tent. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like it was coming from the other side of the world. The boy did not wake anyone, and, armed with a strong lantern and a stout stick, set off in the direction of the amphitheater. There was someone in the center of the structure. Winston froze, not understanding how a person could be here. The logical explanation was that it was someone from the camp, but the figure was dressed in something light-colored, covering almost the entire body. Winston gripped the stick tighter and aimed the beam of light at the man sitting below. "Hey, what are you doing here?" shouted the archaeologist. The figure didn't move. Oliver sank down a couple of steps and froze, sweating with fear. Had the boys decided to play a trick on him, knowing how he felt about all sorts of mysticism? "Norman," he shouted, "if they're trying to scare me, it won't work. I'm going to use this stick." Winston confidently ran down the steps and approached the figure, swinging the stick. Suddenly, the figure rose sharply and turned round. The lantern illuminated a woman's face covered in blood. Winston stepped back, paralyzed with fear. The woman stared at him in silence. "Who are you?" Winston spoke in plain English. "Do you need help? We have a first aid kit. I'll get it for you. Just don't go anywhere. Do you understand me? I'll be back." He was about to leave when suddenly the woman grabbed his arm and addressed him in clear Russian. "You're not a hallucination, you're real. Are you here alone? I didn't hope for help anymore. You see, our motorcade was attacked. We were on our way to Seattle, but we got trapped on the way. Some men pulled us out of our cars, started pushing us around, trying to get us into their truck. I managed to get away. You see, it's getting dark fast. I know the city's not far away, but I'm totally disorientated. I came across these ruins and decided to wait out the night. But it's very cold. If it wasn't for you, I think I'd have frozen to death by morning." Only now Winston noticed that the stranger was wearing a silk business suit that was stained and torn in places, and what he took for a blanket was a jumper and an Arab headscarf. "Lord, let's go to the camp," Oliver exclaimed, taking the woman under his arm. "Can you walk?" "I think so," she answered. "Only my heel seems to be broken." Winston helped her to the camp, lit a fire and sat her on a bench. From the tent he got 2 blankets and a first aid kit. Treating the wound on the stranger's face, the guy saw that she was still quite young, no more than 25 years old. "What is your name?" asked the archaeologist. "My name is Winston. I am an American archaeologist who by fate found himself in this wilderness." "And I'm Mary," the girl answered and even tried to smile. It was obvious that she was still frightened. "Mary Smith. I work at the American Embassy as an interpreter. We traveled from Algeria on a diplomatic mission to a local university. But as I said, we were attacked on the way." "God, what about Sebastian and the others?" She continued confusedly. "I'm the only one who escaped." The girl appeared greatly disturbed. Winston, too, was alerted to the fact that bandits might be lurking nearby. Of course, they had a few guns in the camp, but they could hardly serve as a good defense. "There's no point in worrying about that now," the archaeologist said hastily. "You can't help anyway. Tomorrow we will go down to the city. And there we will think what to do in this situation. Right now you should be glad that you were not captured by these bandits and did not die in the mountains." Norman's head emerged from the tent. Loud voices woke him up. The others also seemed to wake up. In a minute, the whole group was already sitting around the fire. They were surprised at the appearance of a woman in the camp, and a very beautiful one at that. Nobody fell asleep till morning. First, everyone listened to the story of the appearance of a stranger in the camp, and the remaining few hours were on duty. In the morning, the archaeologists loaded their loads onto mules and set off for town. Mary was placed on one of the pack animals, and Winston walked beside her, ready to support her at any moment. You know, if Syed hadn't told us that terrible story the night before Winston began, I'd be fast asleep. I'm afraid to imagine what would have happened to you." "What was the story?" Mary asked. Was it about ghosts in Roman ruins? Exactly, laughed the boy. I don't believe in all that, of course, but somewhere inside there's still hope that there's something left after death. And I believe that we don't go away forever, she said sadly. At the gendarmerie, Mary explained at length to an officer in mirror-polished shoes and white gloves. What happened yesterday? The officer called somewhere several times, making the girl languish in suspense. Winston never left her side. The rest of the guys had gone to a hotel to rest. He realized there was no way Mary could be left alone. After a couple of hours spent in the station, it was learnt that the diplomatic motorcade was attacked by a group of radicals opponents of the ruling party. At that time, relations between the United States and Algeria were developing very unfavorably. But there were those who were against it. The diplomats were taken prisoner and ransomed. Mary got through to the embassy and learned that the negotiations had been successful and that her colleagues would soon be safe. The other end of the line was very happy to hear that the girl was all right. They offered to send a car for her, but Mary refused, preferring to get to the capital by train. Winston was very pleased with this option. It meant that for some time he would be able to continue his acquaintance with this amazing girl. After all, his group also had to take the train to get to the international airport. In the capital, Mary escorted Winston to his flight. Before boarding, they exchanged addresses and phone numbers. A year later, the girl returned to her homeland. By that time, between the young people, there were real feelings. And Winston, in order to please his beloved, even began to learn French. Mary was transferred to the consulate. She sometimes had to go to North Africa, but most of the time she spent in the United States. Winston tried to match his expeditions to his friends' business trips. So it turned out to spend more time together. 2 years later, lovers played a wedding. Winston did not dote on his girlfriend. The girl shared all his hobbies, charged love for her own, so the newlyweds always had something to talk about. Hot arguments caused a discussion of literature. Mary passionately collected books, and if Winston preferred history and architecture, she grabbed every volume of poetry. On their honeymoon, they managed to go not anywhere, but to France. For American citizens, such a trip was something from the category of fantasy. Not everyone could afford to see the Eiffel Tower, but Mary's job at a foreign consulate was a great advantage. She was offered to accompany a high-ranking official to an international forum. The event was to last 3 days, and Mary could stay in a foreign country for another week. And to her great joy, she was allowed to take one relative with her. While his wife attended social receptions, Winston wandered around Paris, took lots of photographs, and practiced his conversational French. A simple American was fascinated by this majestic city. Architectural delights struck his imagination, and people conquered by their hospitality. When Mary's official activities were over, the couple could finally enjoy all this splendor together. The young wife dragged Winston to flea markets, museums, and cozy coffee houses. And at night they took long walks along the Seine embankment and dreamed of the future, enjoying the present. A year later, the couple had a son, Alex. Mary was over the moon with happiness. She inherited from her grandfather a huge flat in the center, where the couple immediately moved. Winston was swamped with work. He was sent to Fort Worth, near which were large-scale excavations of ancient sites. For 5 years, he was home for a maximum of 2 months a year. Mary almost completely took over the upbringing of her son, but even such long absences could not spoil the relationship between the spouses. On those rare days when Winston was home, he tried to make up for the entire period of his absence. Mary and little Alex marveled at how Daddy had so much energy and ideas for things to do together. He organized large-scale excursions around the city, took them to the countryside, arranged some fantastic costume plays at home, and still as heatedly argued with his wife about literary preferences. Finally, his forced exile ended and Winston sighed calmly, except that it became uneasy outside the window. The country was about to undergo a change of power, which some awaited with excitement, others with fear. By 1985, Winston, who successfully defended his doctorate, has already led his own archaeological unit at the university. He rarely traveled to the field, swamped with paperwork. By that time, the man had not yet turned 40, so he was very frustrated by the lack of practical research. Mary continued to work at the consulate, where she returned after her maternity leave. She didn't even have to worry about a position. There were only a handful of specialists like her. And thanks to her natural charm, even conflicts between delegations could be resolved. Alex was already in the 3rd grade and proudly wore a bright red pioneer tie around his neck. Unlike his parents, the boy had an extraordinary passion for English. Mary did her best to send him to one of the most prestigious language schools. By the standards of society, their family was considered exemplary, intelligent, educated, beautiful. The neighbors were especially envious of the fact that the couple never quarreled. Quarrels simply did not fit in their heads. How could they quarrel, living soul to soul? But the couple paid absolutely no attention to what was going on around them. Even suddenly fallen on the country, hard times could not break their strong family. When what was considered an unshakable power began to fall apart, Winston lost his job. No one cared about the ruins of the past when the ruins of the present formed all around. The couple were lucky. Mary was offered a long-term business trip, this time to Canada. The woman agreed without delay, realizing what could happen in her native country in the coming years. The most painful part of the move was perceived by Alex. By that time, he was going through a difficult period of teenage maximalism. Especially, he was in love with his classmate and almost ran away on the eve of the flight. But Winston had a serious talk with his son, convincing him of the need for a temporary move. In Canada, the boy came in handy excellent knowledge of English. He quickly adapted to school and made new friends. Winston managed to get a job as a consultant at the Faculty of Archaeology at the University of Montreal. The couple returned to the States only in 2008, when the country was recovering from another crisis. Alex stayed in Canada, by then enrolled in college. For some reason, Mary was sure that her son would never return to the States. As it turned out, she was right. Alex finished college in Canada, then got a job in New York, married well, and only occasionally came to visit his parents. The couple returned to their luxurious flat, which had been rented for the past few years by a German diplomat. Mary was delighted to find that her favorite books had literally been dusted off. The life of husband and wife flowed again in the usual course. Winston found an interesting niche for himself, consulting and organizing private archaeological expeditions, the demand for which increased sharply by 2000. At home, he only had time to wonder where, and his wife by that time has already passed the 50-year milestone. So much energy. The woman left the civil service and took up tutoring. She liked teaching students French. Young people listened with interest to her stories about her amazing travels in French-speaking countries. And then a terrible thing happened. Mary had a stroke. She was completely paralyzed on the right side of her body. It happened on 6th September 2002. Winston was away at the time, learned about what happened on the phone, and immediately dropped everything to return to his beloved wife. After a long period of rehabilitation, the mobility of the limbs never returned. The disease has severely distorted her speech. All that mattered to Winston was that his wife was alive. But it seemed to Mary that such an existence could not be called life. Winston treated her like a child. He was increasingly annoyed with her. At some point, she was very distant, refused to accept his help, so it was necessary to hire a nurse. In rare moments, when Mary's mood improved, he went into her room and read her long Arabian fairy tales. The woman would cry. Winston was confused. He realized that he was completely helpless in this situation. He even tried to go to a psychologist to establish a relationship with his wife, but everything was to no avail. Mary did not want to be a burden, so she gradually faded away. This went on for 10 years. And then one morning, 6th September 2012, Winston, as usual, went into the bedroom of his wife to say good morning, but was horrified to find her dead. Mary had drifted off to sleep. Her face was calm and even somehow happy. After hearing of his mother's death, Alex returned. The funeral was lavish. Say goodbye to Mary came all her former colleagues, numerous friends. Winston, however, the death of his beloved undermined. The man withdrew into himself, stopped all contact with society. He was horrified to realize that together with Mary went that part of him that made him enjoy every day. His son begged the old man to go with him to the capital, but for Winston such a thing was unacceptable. He took an interest in floriculture, began to grow in indoor greenhouses, his late wife's favorite flowers, lavender. And every year he carried fragrant bouquets to her grave. The old man sighed heavily as he finished his story. Joyce could see that the memories were causing him unbearable pain. "She's been gone 10 years now. But I hope every time I hear her voice again," he said. "I know what it's like," Joyce replied. "My story, though not as romantic, is that when my husband left, my world literally turned upside down. For 4 years now I've been trying to cope with the loss, but I still can't get used to the fact that he's gone." Joyce Winston said to her, "Thank you for listening to the old man's story. You're the first person I've been able to talk to so easily in 10 years. And, I'm relieved." "Winston, this date, the 6th of September, is a fateful date," Joyce said thoughtfully. "Did you meet Mary on that day? She fell ill and died on the same date. My husband died on the 6th of September, and you and I met on the same date. Don't you find that odd?" "I don't know, my dear," said the old man. "I don't believe in mysticism, but I can't help thinking that maybe there is a connection." Winston, Joyce suddenly suggested, "Come and visit us on Sunday. It's my son's birthday." "I'd love for you to meet the children," Joyce said. She felt sorry for the lonely old man, trapped in this huge flat, alone with his memories of his wife. She liked him very much, so she thought it was appropriate to invite him to the family party. "I don't know," Winston replied uncertainly. "Would I be in the way?" "Not at all." Joyce was quick to reassure him. "Of course not. You're such an interesting man. I think it would be nice for you and my children to get to know each other. And you and I have a lot to talk about. Honestly, I can't stand to see you lonely. Please come." "All right," the old man laughed in reply. "I will." From then on, Winston became a frequent visitor to the Joyce family's flat. The children immediately fell in love with the elegant and talkative grandfather, who had stories for every occasion. They listened for hours about his expeditions, traveling to other countries. Often Winston invited them to his house. Catherine was captivated by the old man's library. Together with Elizabeth, they read French fairy tales, looking at ancient engravings depicting the stories. Grandfather, otherwise they did not call Winston, spoilt the children with sweets, showed the outlandish things brought by him from foreign trips. Joyce was happy to have such a friend in the family. They chatted constantly with Winston over coffee, discussing everything that could come to mind. As a conversationalist, the old man was unrivaled. He literally knew everything about everything. Gradually, Joyce got rid of the heavy burden of the past. One weekend, Winston came to visit and immediately took Joyce aside. "Joyce," he began, "we've been in touch for a long time, and I'm amazed at how much my life has been enriched by having someone so close to me in it. I can see how hard it must be for you to raise these wonderful children alone. Tell me honestly, are you happy with your life?" "I don't understand you, Winston," Joyce replied with embarrassment. "Of course I'm content. I have beautiful children, a roof over my head, and now I've got a friend like that. I can't complain, can I?" "That's a good answer," Joyce smiled the old man. "But that's not what I mean," Winston continued. "Let me get this straight. Do you have enough to live on?" Joyce opened her mouth, not knowing what to say. They had never discussed material matters. Well, Winston knew that she worked as a manager in a small firm. She'd never disclosed her salary, but it wasn't hard to guess that it was barely enough to support such a large family. The flat was in treacherous need of repairs. The car was literally screaming for emergency assistance. But did it matter? Joyce Winston continued seriously, "You may not say anything, but I'm not a fool. I can see this isn't easy for you. And frankly, it's a shame to see such a talented and versatile man wasting away in a hopeless job. That's why I have something to offer you. I've been talking to some of my old mates. Tell me, would you be interested in working in your specialty?" "What do you mean?" Joyce was surprised. "What do you mean?" "As a translator." "Joyce, come on. There's a big company looking for a French translator. It's a prestigious job. It's a branch of a well-known French pharmaceutical company. Believe me, you'll be hired." "I've already forgotten the language," Joyce mumbled embarrassedly. "It's nothing," Winston hastened to reassure her. "You speak perfectly well. You don't even have an accent. I know what I'm talking about. If you agree, come to the interview tomorrow. It's more of a formality, but you have to come and get acquainted. You can start work right away." Winston, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "If you're serious, of course I'll do it. What time tomorrow?" "Hang on, Joyce. Tomorrow's the 6th of September. Joyce was really enjoying her new job. She had to socialize with interesting people and regularly fly to France to accompany her boss. She had been in her position for 2.5 years. During this time, it turned out to be possible to establish a life. The children were transferred to a prestigious school. The eternal material problems fell away somehow by themselves. Even in her personal life, there was a shift. Joyce finally let Albert go, and one of her colleagues had a clear sympathy for her, which, to Joyce's surprise, turned out to be mutual on her part. One day her phone rang in the middle of the night, waking her from sleep. She did not immediately understand the meaning of what she heard. A familiar voice announced that Winston had passed away today. The old man had gone quietly, his heart stopping in his sleep. Joyce wept. Over the past few years, this elderly man had managed to become a true friend to her, even more a family man. But his passing had not caused hysteria. She was glad that at last this man would meet his beloved somewhere in heaven, where he stubbornly refused to believe with his mind, but recognized with his heart. Joyce helped with the funeral arrangements. Rummaging through the flat, she found a letter addressed to her, which Winston had apparently written shortly before his death. With trembling hands, she unsealed the envelope. Joyce pulled out a neatly written piece of paper. "My dear Joyce, I didn't want to upset you prematurely, but I feel like I don't have much time left. I'm glad that at the end of my days, life has turned color again. Both you and your children are a real miracle. I have tried to do my best to help you deal with whatever has been keeping you from breathing fully. I want that from now on you have everything so that nothing will prevent you from developing and loving life. So please accept my humble gift for James and Elizabeth, because I know that for yourself you will refuse. With sincere respect and love for you. Winston." Joyce ran her hands over the sheet, not understanding what Winston meant. She was both happy and sad to receive such a message from him after he had gone. Soon Joyce forgot about the letter and plunged headlong into the abyss of everyday life. What was her surprise when 6 months later she received a call from the notary inviting her to attend the reading of Winston's will. At the appointed hour, the 6th of September, the woman entered the office, where she was informed that the last will of the deceased was to bequeath his flat to James, Elizabeth and Catherine Jones, and the library stored in it their mother Joyce Harrison.